you miss me? I've been out of it comatose, but the depression is over.
Hello and welcome to Controlled Burns, the weekly hobby list podcast from your host Andrew Burns, or Slow Burn from Wildfire Gaming. I'm just saying weekly by habit because this is obviously not a weekly podcast at this point, but we are on part 5 of the audiobook that I'm making of A Tale of Blood and Sweatsocks by Mick Foley. I've really enjoyed this experience. Like I mentioned before, I don't want to have too much preamble here. If you're here, you probably want to, at this point, if you made it this far, you probably just want to get into the book. But my wife and I have listened to parts 1 through 3 at this point, just in our travels and things like that. And it's fun to share this with her. So we're gonna continue. I'm gonna chat starting. We're gonna be starting with chapter 27 here. We are over halfway through the book. So, depending on how long we go here, we might have 3 or 4 episodes left. We're gonna see how it goes. Recording this late on a Saturday night. Really, it's Sunday morning now, so I don't know how much stamina I'm gonna have, but I also could record it in a couple of sessions, so we'll just kind of have to see. But with all that said, let's get into chapter 27, Tail and Blood Sweat Socks. Blood and Sweat Socks by Mick Foley. I returned to the States and immediately restructured my priorities. My son was really starting to miss his dad, so I started easing up slightly on my schedule. Between Japan, where I was now spending 10 days every month, and ECW, I began leaving myself some room to relax. I would simply not book myself on one weekend a month, and I would have 11-day stretches during which I could heal up and spend quality family time. At 3, my son was a great age, and I began doing lots of father-son activities with him that we continue to this day. He went to his first amusement park and loved it immediately. We ended up getting passes to a kids' park called American Adventures that gave us especially fond memories. At 1 year of age, my Noelle was a little young for the park, but by the age of 2, she was feeling her oats and would ride just about anything. Now at 5, she has no fear of anything. Even Space Mountain, where her only post-drive comment is, I want to do it again. Mikey and I had lost the tag belts to the Public Enemy, and I had begun a feud with a guy called the Sandman, who is currently wrestling as Hardcore Hack in WCW. The Sandman character was a beer-swilling, cigarette-smoking, cane-swinging Philadelphia guy who was loud and abrasive. We did have good chemistry in the ring together, and in addition to having good matches, I was inspired to cut some of my best promos. Unfortunately for Hack, he was on the receiving end of the aforementioned cast iron skillet and was sidelined for 2 weeks. This left me no one to wrestle in March's ECW arena show. Paulie's mind went to work and he came up with a winner. I was to wrestle a mystery partner in the main event of the evening. Speculation was running rampant as to who it might be. Abdullah the Butcher, King Kong Bundy, Road Warrior Hawk, and even the estranged Funker were names that were thrown around. One thing was for sure, Paulie would never let the fans down. I went to the ring first and waited for the mystery opponent. A huge box was rolled to the ring draped in curtains. Through the curtain and out of the box stepped the legend, the man, the myth, DC Drake. Now, DC Drake was a hell of a nice guy and a few years earlier had been a mainstay for Joel Goodhart's TWA. But in the 3.5 years that had elapsed, he seemed to have lost some of the zing off his fastball. We stunk up the arena, and the ECW faithful were not happy at all with our 5-minute extravaganza. Thankfully, the night was not over. Out of the box stepped the Sandman, whose brains by this point were in the final process of unscrambling. He was dressed in his familiar attire of red shirt, white tennis sneakers, and red, white, and blue exercise pants. I was waiting for him, and after ducking a swing with his cane, gave him 3 shots and threw him right back into the box from which he'd come. The curtain fell down on top of him, and I wasn't quite through. I reached in and pulled him out, curtain and all, and rolled his sorry ass into the ring. I could see him wobbling in his red, white, and blue pants as I prepared to pull the curtain off and inflict more damage. I pulled the curtain off, but to the surprise of everyone, not the Sandman, the legendary Terry Funk in all his glory. The Funker had returned. The response from the crowd was phenomenal when the fans realized just who it was that stood before them. We went punch for punch until the Sandman cut me off from behind and armed with 2 Singapore canes, better known as the martial arts weapon, the kendo stick. The 2 identically clad grapplers commenced to putting a hurting on me. I took a total of 46, no, I'm not kidding, cane shots to the head, arms, back, and legs before Shane Douglas interrupted the proceedings. Shane, the self-coined franchise, was the ECW champ and the most hated heel in the company. Despite our different roles in the promotion, ECW announcer Joey Styles had in the past readily acknowledged our real-life friendship and background at Danucci's. When Shane stepped slowly into the ring, he motioned for Funk and Sandman to hold me and ready to level me with his championship belt. Shane started for me, but veered right at the last moment and laid out Funk. Steph left and laid out the Sandman. The crowd went wild, but more importantly, the Cactus Funk feud would continue to be big news on both sides of the Pacific. I cut some interviews with Shane and then rested up for my next tour of Japan. I flew to Japan for a short trip, just 2 shows. The importance of the trip cannot be overstated, however, as our first show would be in the sold out 64,000 seat Tokyo Dome as part of a 13 promotion supercard. For promotion that was used to doing business in small freezing gyms, this was a huge opportunity. 13 offices would contribute one match each to this card, which would set an all time gate record of somewhere around $6 million. We knew that the other promotions would each try to steal a show, as we were likewise planning on doing our damnedest to achieve. The match we had booked was an 8-man barbed wire bat death match that would pit the team of Funk, Leatherface, Nakamaki, and Ono against me, the Headhunters, and someone I can't remember. The barbed wire bat was a standard baseball bat wrapped heavily in barbed wire, and the barbed wire boards were simply plywood boards that had loose bales of barbed wire nailed to them. The concept was a little different, but simple nonetheless. All 8 men would line up on the stage of the massive dome. The announcer would count us down from 10, and at 0, we would all make a mad dash for the ring, which contained the deadly bat. The match would then continue until one of the team members was pinned in this anything goes free for all. I had my doubts about just what the sprint down the 60-yard Tokyo Dome ramp might look like. I mean, we didn't exactly look like a track team backstage. On one hand, Funk was over 50 and had knees that looked like a cartoonist had drawn them on his body. They certainly didn't look like human knees. Nakamaki was no athletic wonder, and Leatherface was a 320-pound Canadian who was coming off a severe foot injury. He had tried to catch one of the headhunters, 2 400-pound identical twins from the Dominican Republic, and the fall had not just broken his foot, but crushed it. I myself had been one of the slowest guys on the Ward Melville lacrosse team, long before the ring injuries took their toll. Well, maybe Ono or the guy I can't remember could run. We stood in the waiting area while the match before us went on. To put it kindly, the match was god-awful, but the crowd was going crazy. The contestants Ruma Go and his 2 masked Americans were putting on one of the worst performances I'd ever seen, but the sold-out crowd was eating up every bit of it. These guys made the Test Rodney match look like Flair's Steamboat. "This is great," I yelled to one of the headhunters. "If they react to this garbage, wait till they see Terry." The reprehensible match mercifully ended, and 4 at a time the 2 teams took to the stage. There was a slight bit of a pause when our team showed up. Very slight. To tell you the truth, I thought my growing recognition would have resulted in a better response than this. I got over it quickly and waited anxiously for the huge roar that would greet the legendary Funker. The Funker arrived, but unfortunately the roar didn't. It was polite and far more than our team had merited, but it was far from deafening. I couldn't figure it out, especially given the reaction to the previous match, and I stood dumbfounded in front of 64,000 fans. What I didn't realize is that Ruma Go is a big wrestling joke that the whole country is in on. His matches were supposed to be bad, and the fans loved him for it. This was information that I wish I had access to, because to tell you the truth, I felt like a big jerk standing out there. As a matter of fact, we stood there for a long time. Someone had forgotten to tell the announcer about the 10-second countdown, and as a result, we had no way of starting our match. Finally, after what seemed like hours, but was probably a good 5 minutes, I heard Funk yell over, "I guess someone better run." I took the initiative and took off down the ramp. Because the 64,000-seat dome had all the emotion of the world's largest funeral, I figured I would be able to hear footsteps on the hard wooden ramp. I didn't. Instead, I looked back and saw the Danger Man a good 30 yards behind me. I slowed to a jog and then finally a slow walk while I waited for Nakamaki to catch up. When he finally did, I turned around and followed a boot to his midsection up with the DDT on the ramp. Ooh-ah! It was slight, but I heard it. The rest of the crew still had a lot of catching up to do. I walked into the ring and casually took control of the bat. Seconds later, Terry stepped through the ropes, and I raised the bat over my head to give him the impression that I actually intended to use it on him. I was being so deliberate that my body language was literally screaming out to be cut off. I was expecting a boot to the stomach or at worst a wide-open back to swing at, but the Funker did neither. Instead, he closed one eye and looked up at me with the other. His fists were clenched tightly and his body was shaking. I could read his body language loud and clear. It was literally screaming, "Hit me." I brought the bat down hard over Terry's head. I won't pretend it was full speed, but it wasn't half-assed either. I had just taken a three-quarter speed swing at a defenseless old man with a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire. Ooh-ah! I heard the reaction that time. It had hurt me to have to lambaste my own idol, but in fulfillment of my prediction made 7 months earlier in the ECW arena, not as bad as it had hurt him. Rivulets of blood streamed down Terry's face from 4 different puncture wounds. Terry had dropped to his knees and was obviously in great pain. This time, when I lifted the bat overhead, he was quick to react. He kicked me in the stomach, and when I dropped the bat, he was there to recover the fumble. I looked at the blood streaming down his face and knew that payback would be hell. I gave him my back, and he took full advantage of it. 4 times the bat went up, and 4 times it came down. 4 times I heard the ooh-ah from the crowd as they started to gain an understanding of what the IWA was all about. I separated from Terry and turned my attention elsewhere. Nakamaki and I had a big move lined up, and I figured the time was right. I put the boot to the journalist turned wrestler and then placed one of the barbed wire boards in the middle of the ring. I took a bottle of lighter fluid from one of the young boys and proceeded to generously douse the board. I returned the bottle and was handed a lighter. Believe it or not, that psycho danger man bastard wanted me to suplex him off the top rope into a board of flaming barbed wire. The crowd that minutes earlier hadn't given a damn about us were now on the edge of their seats. The buzz from the sold out crowd was giving me a buzz of my own as I set the lighter to the board. Ooh, went the crowd, but nothing. Another flick of my bic, but I couldn't get the damn thing to light. The crowd caught on and began laughing at us. It was not a great feeling. Finally, after flickering uselessly, I gave up. I could see the disappointment in Nakamaki's eyes as we quickly came up with a plan B. As plan Bs go, it was pretty good. I slammed Nakamaki on the failed board and then threw another on top of him. Headhunter B climbed the top rope and completed a perfect moonsault, sandwiching Nakamaki between the boards with his 400-pound frame. Ooh, we had them back. The match concluded with what one wrestling journalist called the greatest clusterfuck of incredible moves ever seen in the ring. Bodies were flying all over, and somewhere in the mayhem, I split my left arm open, causing the thick pink scars that have become something of a trademark. I honestly don't remember who won, but we had all worked extremely hard, and the match itself had been a major victory for our little group of dedicated bloodletters. I wrestled the next night with my arm heavily bandaged. It was a decent match, but nothing memorable. I do remember vividly that I never received a dime out of that $6 million house. On a strange side note, I found out later that the fire marshal would have shut down the entire show if the board had gone up in flames. I would have gone down in wrestling history as the guy who killed the biggest show of all time. Asana was so mad at us that he slapped the referee even though he was completely innocent. I guess you can always get away with that if you have $500 million. Chapter 28. When I returned home, Colette had great news. She had been offered a job with Wilhelmina Models in New York, the same company she had done so well with years earlier. Within 15 months, she had gone from a 180-pound pregnant housewife into something out of the pages of Muscle and Fitness. I'd had my doubts when she started doing Jane Fonda aerobics in the living room, but was pleasantly surprised to see her still stepping and jumping weeks later. She was obviously pleased with the results, and with my encouragement, began coming with me to the gym that Sting owned outside Atlanta. Colette started wearing out the cardio equipment, and her achievements were not going unnoticed, as no less an authority than Diamond Dallas Page declared her an inspiration. I began talking to Colette about giving modeling another try, as I truly felt that she was more beautiful than I'd ever seen her, modeling photos included. In the years since Colette had left modeling, the industry had changed quite a bit, and girls were no longer washed up at 23. She had photos done in Atlanta and was welcomed back to her old company, albeit in their mature ladies division. We rented our house in Atlanta and packed up for my old stomping grounds, Long Island, New York. Colette had some reservations about making us move, but I assured her that the move would also make things easier on me as well. From New York, I could fly nonstop to Tokyo and could commute to most ECW shows as well. All in all, a move to New York would be easier on me and allow Colette a second chance to do what she loved. My parents were also thrilled to be close to their grandchildren and loving hardcore legend of a son. Months later, Colette thanked me for never once making her feel fat or unattractive, even though she herself had felt that way. I kissed her and told her that she'd always been beautiful to me. Still, I was glad to have my gorgeous, slim wife back. Yes. The next few months seemed to blend together professionally. I feuded with Funker in the US and I feuded with Funker overseas. Actually, Terry was not on all the Japanese tours, and sometimes it was just me and Leatherface on the Gaijin side of things. The trips were long and the amenities stank, but I was selling my shirts and getting over with the fans, and the boredom of life so far from home was a price I had to pay. I read a hell of a lot over there and became better acquainted with my body. I read books of all types, ranging from classics like Moby Dick to biographies in Civil War history. My personal favorite was a book I found called Sins by Judith Gould, which actually featured my wife on the cover. She had modeled for the painting. The book was definitely not typical men's fare, but I was fascinated by the idea that my wife was the title character who built her own fashion empire. Despite the hard work and solitude, I was proud of my efforts in Japan. Tarzan Goto had jumped ship from the rival FMW, and his addition had helped fuel an IWA resurgence. IWA had announced plans for a King of the Deathmatch tournament for the beginning of August in the 40,000-seat Kawasaki Stadium. The idea had seemed ludicrous at first, but with me, Funk, Goto, the Headhunters, and Nakamaki leading the way, the IWA had become the hottest small promotion in Japan. Colette was working steadily, nothing big yet, but enough to make it worthwhile. Dewey was adjusting well to Dad's long absence, and Noelle's little personality was really starting to bloom. I remember when she was only weeks old, I said to Colette, I bet she's going to have her own little personality, which was a very nice of saying, we really don't have a very good-looking child. We thought that we were going to have a very plain-looking daughter with a very serious personality, for Noelle seldom smiled as a baby. At about that time in Long Island, however, she began to really blossom, and the beauty of her tiny face is now matched only by the beauty of her little ways. I was able to drive to most of the ECW shows, which was a big help, and I'd often drive my buddy Mikey home with me, where he'd sleep on our bed in the basement before I dropped him off in the morning. One day I had Colette and the kids with me as we returned Mikey to his home, and we saw a mother cat frolicking with her kittens. Aren't those kitties nice? I asked my son, who nodded in agreement. Can you say that, buddy? I asked, knowing that, like most kids, Dewey had trouble with certain letters. Nice titties, Dewey yelled out, prompting an unsuspected Mikey to spit milk all over the dashboard. My hard work was paying off. I had been gone from WCW for almost a year, and although I hadn't made nearly as much money as I had with a big company, I had actually saved more of it. I didn't need anybody, I could make my own schedule, and I loved it. I pulled into the ECW arena in August of 1995, a few hours late, as I had become lost on my way to the building. I've been to the damn place over a dozen times, but its whereabouts always seemed to elude me. I had Colette and the kids with me as we were planning on going to Pennsylvania Dutch country afterward. Paul Lee ran up to me in desperation. Cactus, he gasped. I've got a big angle and it will change the course of your career and maybe even your life. You don't have to do it and you can think about it for a long time. What is it, Paul? The mad scientist was sweating and was looking older than his 30 years. Cactus, I want you to turn heel. This was indeed a career altering decision that could very well change the course of my life. I thought about it deeply for about 3 seconds. Okay, I said, let's do it. I was scheduled to take part in an 8-man tag team match. On one side would be Raven and 3 of the Dudley Boys. The Dudley Boys had started out as a takeoff on the Hanson brothers, who have appeared in the Paul Newman hockey movie Slapshot. The movie was dated, but the Hansons were timeless. Their taped up black eyeglasses, overalls, and long greasy hair lent a comedic look that was countered by an aggressive style. In time, the Dudley clan would grow to include an American Indian, a black guy, and Sign Guy Dudley, who should not be confused with the original Sign Guy, a strange fan who sat first row ringside and held up a vast arsenal of original signs. The original Sign Guy had once held up a sign that said Cane Dewey, a thought that was supposed to be humorous but had made Colette sick to her stomach upon hearing of it. Our team consisted of Cactus Jack, Pitbulls 1 and 2, and Tommy Dreamer. Tommy was a personal project of Paul E.'s, who was willing to do anything for the acceptance of the fans. He'd once been a laughingstock of the company, as no matter what body part he sacrificed, the fans continued to shower him with ridicule. The hardcore ECW fans had despised him partly because he was a good-looking young man, and partly because of his ridiculous ring attire that included green suspenders. Eventually, his determination, Paul E's ingenuity, and other talented wrestlers got him over to the point where he was at least respected, if not completely loved. The fans' chants to him of he's hardcore seemed at least partially in jest, but nonetheless he seemed poised on the brink of stardom and needed just a little something extra to push him completely over it. I was it. The match was well received by the 1,000 plus in attendance at the bingo hall. Tommy was in the midst of a nearly year-long feud with Raven that had seen Tommy on the receiving end of unbelievable punishment, but no clean victories. This was the night he finally had his chance. The ring had emptied and Tommy had planted Raven with a DDT. The referee moved in for the count, but it was broken up at 2 by a big Cactus Jack cowboy boot to the head. My gear bag had been stolen months earlier, including my leopard skin cactus boots, and I had been too cheap to replace them. I lifted the baffled Dreamer off the floor and caught him quickly with a double-arm DDT on a chair. I pulled Raven over top of him, and once again, Dreamer was denied. I left the ring to the open-jawed response of the crowd. Some of the best work of my career was about to begin. I left the auditorium of the ECW arena for the tranquility of the Amish farmlands. After a few days of relaxation and shoe fly pie, I flew to Tokyo for a 10-day tour that would culminate in the longest day of my life. Chapter 29. August 18th, 1995. We had been on the road for 8 days and had traveled via the Japanese bullet train into the wee hours of the morning. We were awakened after about 5 hours sleep, and took the 2-hour bus trip from the Ikebukuro section of Tokyo into Yokohama. I stepped off the bus in front of the dilapidated baseball stadium and knew right away that I was going to be in trouble. It was only 10 in the morning, but the temperature was already over 90. The humidity was almost unbearable. I walked into the stadium where they had 3 rings set up in the infield part of the stadium. The day would be filled with a variety of inhuman gimmick matches, and the 3-ring setup would ensure speedy transitions between matches. Without them, we would have been there until September. I looked at the brackets for the King of the Ring deathmatch tournament. I would be facing Terry Gordy in the opening round in a barbed wire bat, 10,000 thumbtack match. The thumbtacks would be placed in 2 shallow boxes, and the object was simple: get your opponent in the box, in an attempt to get the pin. If I were victorious in the opening match, which I had reason to believe I would be, I would take on the winner of the Nakamaki Ono contest in a barbed wire board bed of nails match. Pretty self-explanatory. Then on to the grand finale, the coup de grace, the big daddy of them all, the no rope, barbed wire, board, C4 explosive, exploding ring death match. I don't mind telling you that the concept scared me a little bit. I was okay with everything up until the C4, and then had some questions. The C4 was rigged to four of the barbed wire boards and would be detonated upon impact. I had seen exploding rings in Japanese videos before, and they were a sight to be seen. At the 10-minute mark of the match, a cannon like concussion would go off on all four sides of the ring. The concussions were ear splitting in volume and threw unbelievable firepower into the sky. I've been told by the funker who had survived one of these things that if you lie on the canvas, you'd be okay, but that it was hotter than hell and hard to breathe for a few minutes until the smoke cleared. Victor Quinones summoned me to the outfield, where the demolitions expert was about to give us a C4 demonstration. I stood there looking at the barbed wire board, which had two explosives attached to each end of the 6-foot plywood. Funk, Nakamaki, Leatherface, and I gathered around, and the expert flicked a switch. Ba-boom! It was the loudest thing I'd ever heard in my life. Scariest, too. I was the first to speak up. No way, I gasped. That thing will kill us. Nakamaki and Leatherface agreed. Then the wise and grizzled funker spoke up, and with 30 years of experience aiding his judgment, said, No, that looks fine. But I think we would need two more right in the middle. Then it will be great. Terry, I said, with more than a little desperation in my voice, you've got to be kidding. There will be nowhere to land. How can we land if there will be explosives all over the damn thing? Terry thought about it and smiled his Terry smile. No, Cactus, it'll be fine. Trust me. I did, and later wished I hadn't. At 1 o'clock, we hit the gimmick table for a 2-hour selling session. I'd been coming to Japan only 7 months, but in that time, the Japanese yen had lost a great deal of its value. I sold my shirts for 2,000 yen, but that amount brought in only 16 US, whereas in January, the same shirt yielded 24 US. I knew that I was in for a torturous tournament, but damn it, I'm a salesman, not a wrestler. I was positioned with the headhunters at the table by the rear entrance. While the Japanese boy sat under a veranda by the main entrance, the gaijin sweated it out in the hot sun. Sales were brisk for this big event, and I left the table at bell time as a haughtier, sweatier, but somewhat richer man. I rated myself for the Gordy match. Terry Gordy had at one time been one of the best 10 wrestlers in the world. He had been celebrated as a member of the original Freebirds and had been a legend in All Japan Wrestling before an accident put him in a coma for several years. Or days. Sorry. When he reemerged, he was never quite the same. Terry had attempted his comeback a short while later, but it was painful to watch. The vicious, aggressive Gordy was gone, and in his place stood a confused, sluggish man. His punches and kicks, which had at one point been his calling card, now looked particularly weak. One of my saddest memories was of Terry at an independent show in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where at intermission he took to the ring for Polaroids. Only 2 or 3 fans bothered to pose with one of wrestling's true greats, and my heart went out to him. Even sadder, Terry didn't take that as a cue to leave, and instead stood inside the empty ring for several minutes, smiling his sad Muppet smile. To his credit, however, Terry had trained intensely after his injury. He was actually in better physical condition than he was in his prime, and as the months went by, some of the mental fog seemed to lift. There were brief periods in matches where he looked like the Gordy of old. Unlike the U.S., where a wrestler is seemingly forgotten overnight, the Japanese had a deep sense of tradition, and Terry's name was still valuable. Knowing this, Mr. Asano had hired him for the tournament, the ramifications of which apparently Terry was unaware of. A week earlier, the IWA had held a press conference to hype the tournament, which had gained surprisingly strong fan support. When asked about his first round match, Terry referred to an excellent bout that we had wrestled for the Global Wrestling Federation in the summer of 1991. Jack, I dropped you on your head once and I can do it again. I was given a chance to respond and yelled, That was different, Gordy. Tell me what you're going to do when you step into that ring at Kawasaki Stadium and see those 10,000 thumbtacks. I'm going to turn your ass into the world's largest pincushion. Terry's eyes seemed to grow as wide as saucers, and after the press conference, he approached me. Bro, he said in his deep and basset sound voice, I didn't know anything about no thumbtacks. I approached this match very seriously for a couple of reasons. I wanted to have a great match to set the tone for the show, but just as importantly, I wanted to honor and preserve Terry's reputation. I was really concerned about the weakness of Terry's punches and told him so. Terry, I said, I want this match to look good, and I think maybe to play it safe, you should just hit me your hardest out there. Are you sure, bro? He wanted to know. Yeah, Terry, I am. Terry looked at me sadly, and I could tell the words that followed were difficult for him to say. Bro, just help me out there. I came out of the dugout to the strains of a song by the band Megadeth. The Japanese had a great knack for picking cool entrance music, and this was no different. I could feel the hot sun beating down on me as I looked at the crowd, which was pretty damn impressive. 30,000 fans had turned out to see this little company that could. Gordy was then announced, and we lined up on opposite sides of the ring, about 30 yards from the ring, as the announcer counted us down in English. 10, 9, 8. I was nervous as hell. 7, 6, 5. My heart was pounding, but I knew that I was ready. 4, 3, 2. Gordy jumped the gun, and by the time my big ass got into the ring, he was waiting with the barbed wire bat. I fed him my back and he took full advantage. I took 2 hard hits and bailed out to the floor where Gordy followed. Go ahead, Terry, hit me, I yelled. Whatever fears I had had about his punches disappeared immediately. Bam! I felt the smack of his fist against skull. Bam! 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 I finally turned and staggered away. I reached for my head and felt the sticky warmth of my own blood. Without even meaning to, Terry had busted my eyebrow open. He hadn't let me down. I could almost hear Harley grumbling all the way from Kansas City. As a matter of fact, the cover photo of the Raw issue, titled Blood, Guts, and Mick Foley, was taken right after these punches were thrown. I rolled into the ring, and the Terry Gordy of old followed me in. He whipped me into the turnbuckle and followed me in with a brutal clothesline. When I ran, I stepped into the shallow box, and the sole of one of my cowboy boots filled with thumbtacks. Another whip, another clothesline, and I went down next to the box, with my face actually turned to its side on top of the tiny gold tacks. Gordy gave me a stiff boot to the other side of my face, and I could feel the pushpin sinking into my flesh. Ooh-ah! I staggered to my feet and did my best slow, stumbling watsui so that every fan could take a good look. The response was incredible, like a feeling of disgust and enjoyment at the same time. It seemed kind of like when the great white shark is dragging Quaint into his mouth in the movie Jaws. Painful to watch, but fun nonetheless. I guess it was kind of like watching the Mean Street Posse in action, except for the fun part. A minute later, Terry picked me up for the power bomb. The timing was off, and Terry didn't get me very high, but he brought me down right in the middle of the tacks, and the crowd went wild. Gordy turned to the fans and did his unique celebratory dance while I picked up a handful of tacks. When Terry turned to me, I threw the tacks at his face. When he covered up, I gave him a boot to the stomach and a DDT into the box for the win. It had been a tremendous match, and I was exhausted, but happy. With the exception of his hand, Terry had escaped thumbtack free. In contrast to my press conference prediction, it was actually I who had returned into the world's largest pincushion. After the match, I was interviewed for the King of the Deathmatch commercial video, which would be a huge success around the world, despite the fact that I never received a dime for it. My interview was strong as I praised Gordy for having taught me a valuable lesson, but it couldn't match Terry's for its verbiage and delivery. Fuck. I can't believe that fucker beat me. Fuck. I retreated to the dressing area where I was shocked to find that there was no water, soda, juice, or beverages of any kind. I looked around to see if Bill Watts had secretly taken over. I ended up going into the concession area where a fan was more than happy to buy a sports drink for the bleeding, sweating Cactus Jack. The Danger Man, Shoji Nakamaki, had defeated Ono in their match, so a short while later I looked on with great interest as 2 huge beds of nails were brought to ringside. I had only seen one other bed of nails match, featuring the team of Nakamaki and Ono against 2 Leatherfaces, and it had been obscene in its brutality. Mike Kirchner had been the original Leatherface for the FMW promotion in Japan. It had a short run in the World Wrestling Federation as Corporal Kirchner in the mid-80s, but their attempt at making him a new Sergeant Slaughter had failed, and he had been drifting in the business for years before catching on in Japan. He was a nice guy, but he had a short fuse, and 2 years earlier an argument that he had not started ended with him punching a Japanese man in the face. The punch had been so devastating that the man's face had been almost destroyed, and Kirchner spent 6 months in Japanese jail as a result. During his incarceration, Rick Patterson from Canada was suited up for the popular Leatherface gimmick, and I moved to IWA when Victor Quinones jumped ship. 6 months later, with Kirchner returning, the tag team of the Leatherfaces was formed. They only lasted one match, the Bed of Nails. Kirchner was pretty adamant about not losing in his return to the ring, and when he did, he became incensed. "Let's get these bastards," Kirchner yelled in his deep, gravelly voice. Kirchner had ripped off a piece of the board, though small feat, and had handed it to Patterson to press down on Ono's neck. Now, the secret of the nails, if there is such a thing, is to try to land on as many of the nails as possible. By doing this, no one nail has the chance to do serious damage. Kirchner was about to prove that theory's flip side. Fewer nails equals more damage. As he yelled, "Hold him there, I'm gonna drop a fucking leg on him." Patterson was a kind human being, and he tried to hold the board steady to minimize the impact. No such luck, however, as the former corporal came down full force and drove the nail dangerously deep into Ono's neck. It wasn't enough. "Let's give him a fucking power bomb," he ordered. Ono fought the powerbomb, but Kirchner was not to be denied, and he flipped him up and dropped him down on the brutal, nail-filled board. He was fired immediately. Now, I'm not a sadist, and I don't take liberties, but this was a big match, and people were expecting big things. Luckily, the Danger Man loved this type of thing. The hot afternoon sun was giving way to a somewhat cooler evening as I took to the ring. Nakamaki stepped in, and the Bed of Nails barbed wire board match was on. I put the boots to good old Shoji and then threw him outside. I set up one of the wire boards against the ring and whipped him toward it. He reversed it, and I hit the board, but bounded right back with a clothesline. The Insane Clown Posse, a rap group that later appeared in the World Wrestling Federation, released a commercial video of the match that continued some unique commentary. "He shoots Cactus Jack," my name in their version, my father was Prickly Balls, "into the barbed wire, but look, it doesn't even faze the toothless bastard." Actually, not much was phasing me that day. I was in the zone. I was putting a beating on Nakamaki, but was taking some punishment as well. I slammed him inside the ring on the barbed wire board and went for a big elbow. Shoji moved, and it was I who now landed on the wire. Years later, even Paul Bearer winced when he saw the tape and saw wire sticking in my shoulder as I tried to get up. I took some Nakamaki headbutts, his big move, but came right back and dropped him on the wire. It was time to introduce the bed of nails. I slid it into the ring and popped it into the corner as the crowd began to buzz. I grabbed the bleeding Danger Man and, standing above him, attempted to grind his head into the nails. Bleeding was part of Nakamaki's gimmick. Don't feel bad for him. He would have bled that night even if I'd never touched him. To many in the strange Japanese subculture of garbage wrestling, scar tissue was seen as a badge of courage, and many young wrestlers set about getting that badge by any means necessary. To be honest, my career had benefited greatly from my scarred arm. It made me legitimate in many fans' eyes. Nakamaki scooted out backward through my legs and delivered a headbutt. I fell into the bed. Ooh-ah! The crowd loved it. Another headbutt, another fall, another ooh-ah. The nails pierced my skin and pain shot through my body, but it honestly wasn't that bad. I was rocking and reeling, but I stopped him and threw him into the infield grass. We were right by the second bed of nails, and when I picked him up, they stood in unison to see the impact of flesh on pointed steel. Instead, I slammed him somewhat harmlessly on the stadium infield. I could hear the disappointment from the fans, but I had a definite plan, and it didn't include something as mundane as a simple slam on the nails. No, they deserved more. By God, I was getting paid $300 for the day, $100 per match, and I was going to give the fans in Asano every penny's worth. I lifted the board, leaned it over Nakamaki, and then quickly hopped to the ring apron. The crowd was on its feet again. I think they could smell what I was cooking. I raised my arm toward the heavens and took off on my familiar two-step course down the apron. Nakamaki was only 8 feet away, but in this case, distance didn't matter. He was under a bed of effing nails. I took off and landed hard. I tried to take care of the poor guy, but I'd be lying if I said I cared more about his physical well-being than about the well-being of the videotape. His pain would go away, eventually. The video wouldn't. And besides, in an attempt to ease my conscience, the guy loves it. Actually, he didn't look like he was feeling a whole lot of love as he lay there writhing on the ground. My experience with the nails hadn't been too bad, but I couldn't say the same for Nakamaki. The nails had dug in deep in a couple of spots, and he was in considerable pain. Okay, he assured me when I asked him how he was. The ending was less than smooth as I attempted to superplex him off the top rope onto the boards. Nakamaki was a notorious sandbagger who was almost impossible to lift off the ground. Instead, I gave him a sloppy-looking low suplex in the ring and finished him with a DDT on the barbed wire board. 2 down, 1 to go. Meanwhile, on the other side of the bracket, Terry Funk had defeated Leatherface in a chain match, and Tiger Jeet Singh in a glass match when my interference backfired. Tiger was another veteran of Japan, and in some ways a legend also, but to me he was the antithesis of Terry Funk. Terry had become an icon through 30 years of blood, sweat, and tears, while Tiger had done it with a few wins over Antonio Inoki, back when Inoki never lost. Terry stayed over by constantly giving to other people. He gave of his heart, his wisdom, and his kindness. Tiger stayed over by taking. I had been on the cover of the Japanese wrestling magazine Baseball the week of the tournament. Don't ask me why they call it baseball. I don't know. I also don't know why such a technologically advanced country has little porcelain holes in the ground to poop in instead of toilets. The few toilets they did have tended to be luxury models with heating devices and bidets. I don't know why. I also don't know why their versions of respected news magazines had nude centerfolds. I do know why Tiger stayed over, however. He was smart. He saw me on the cover of Baseball magazine and immediately convinced Asano to team the two of us up. As soon as Asano gave the go-ahead, he called a press conference. Even though he was still in his underwear, he had photographers shoot our training session, which included beating up a couple of young boys in the ring. I'm sure the Japanese fans saw it as an example of the wild tiger on the loose. My wife, however, saw it another way. When I returned home, she took one look at Tiger's picture and said, "Who's the old guy with his balls showing?" Soon enough, upon closer viewing, I could see the great Tiger's wrinkly sack peeking through his BVDs. Tiger had taken me out to eat with him on the first night of the tour. 20 years earlier, when wrestling was on primetime TV in Japan, the foreigners who were stars were able to attract sponsors who took care of them. The sponsors would wine and dine them and often give them huge sums of money for the pleasure of their company. It was almost like prostitution, but without the sex. In the current era, sponsors were simply fans who took us out to eat, but a number of old stars like Tiger had held on to their old contacts. We were picked up in Ikebukuro by a friend of Tiger's in a Cadillac, which was a very rare luxury in Japan. We drove 2 hours to Kobe, and along the way, Tiger was giving instructions on how to act in front of the sponsors. Don't shake hands, look at me, do what I do. Tiger kept coaching me on the way to the restaurant. When we got there, I undoubtedly had the best meal of all my tours. The Korean barbecue was unreal, and I ate with gusto until my belly swelled with satisfaction. Now I wanted to go, but apparently it wasn't time yet. I sat there while the others talked, and I thought about the Yakuza, Japanese mafia. The only thing I knew was that they sported tattoos over their entire upper bodies, kind of like the World Wrestling Federation dressing room, and had part of their pinky finger cut off as a sign of either loyalty or disloyalty. I looked across the table at my three new buddies and tried to inconspicuously check out their fingers. I felt like I did when I was trying to look down at Irene Farugia's cleavage in 10th grade. They were there. No finger, no finger, no finger. I could see Ricky Nelson singing again, but I had no way to leave. Hours later, after hearing no English except for a stunning karaoke version of Green Green Grass of Home, it was time to go. I saw Tiger walk up to our sponsors and shake their hands. Hey, I thought that was a no-no. When he did, I heard the unmistakable crumple of paper money being exchanged. Predictably, there were no handshakes or exchanges of crumpled money for the hardcore legend. On the way back to Tokyo, I promised myself that I would never do it again. From then on, I stuck to my sponsors, normal fans who would pick up the tab. Most of the time, I drank Met RX or paid for myself. A friend asked me one time how much money I spent during a week in Japan. I asked him to guess, and having heard of outrageous Japanese food prices, he aimed high. 1,000? He asked. No, I replied. It's a little lower than that. 800? I shook my head. After he had guessed a couple more figures, I broke the news. I spent about 100 a week. 100? An astonished friend blurted out. That's only $15 a day. I smiled and said, I know. I go to Japan to make money, not to spend it. On this night at the Kawasaki Stadium, however, I was hoping, in addition to money, that I would be bringing as much of myself home as possible. I looked in the mirror and saw a weary man looking back. I had a large gash over my right eye and considerable swelling underneath. My left arm was slightly cut, and my back was killing me. I really wasn't even going to try to have a good match. I was just going to try to get through it. I could still hear those C4 explosions in my mind, and they still scared the hell out of me, despite the Funker's assurances. I thought of Colette, Noelle, and Dewey at home. I missed them terribly and wanted to see them. I was looking forward to my post-tour ritual of a Japanese chocolate bar and ice cream in my bed. I was looking forward to the trip home, even if it would be spent jammed into seat 26B. I sat down on my bench and said a prayer. I walked into the dugout. It was nightfall, with the humidity all but gone. It had turned into a beautiful starry evening. The semi-main event was in the ring, Tarzan Goto against Ultimate Fighting Champion Dan the Beast Severn. Years later, in Chattanooga, I asked Owen Hart how his match with the Beast had gone. Owen said, he's a nice guy. I stopped and called to Owen, who was walking away. Owen, I didn't ask you what kind of guy he was. I asked about how the match went. Owen smiled and gave his little chuckle, which I will miss hearing very much. The answer came back. He's a really nice guy. Dan never really could make the transition from ultimate fighting to sports entertainment. On this night, however, he and Goto were having a hell of a match, and the crowd was eating it up. I stepped back into my dressing room to make some final mental preparations, but I couldn't help feeling good for Dan. He really was a nice guy. When I went into the ring, I was still scared, but filled with a feeling of power that was not unlike my feeling of being on top of the scaffold in Fort Worth 6 years earlier. Some of the fans were chanting, Cactusa! But most were physically and mentally worn out from hours of sunshine and bloodshed. The Funker arrived in the ring to his decades-old theme music and chants of, Telly! Telly! He looked old and worn out. Hell, he was old and worn out. His shirt was splattered with blood from his previous matches tumble into the plate glass. It went without saying that Terry would be the guy taking the bump in the glass. It wasn't Tiger's style. Once again, Terry had given, Tiger had taken. The bell rang and we stalked each other like Rocky and Apollo Creed in the last round of Rocky. Terry flicked out a couple of weak jabs that grazed my eye and opened my gash slightly. It was tough to get a rhythm going. Barbed wire matches were tough enough, even without the added presence of boards laced with explosions in every corner. We tried to use the wire, but we found to do some moves. We fought outside and used the non-explosive boards, and I even hit Terry with a half-used spool of barbed wire. We rolled back into the ring, and Terry pulled one of the boards into the middle of the ring. Kawasaki Stadium started to buzz. This is what they came to see. With the ominous board in the center of the ring, we picked up the pace. Punch for punch we went, and then I took over. Wham! A forearm staggered the grizzled veteran. Wham! Another one had him reeling. Terry was positioned directly in front of the board and was about to go down. 4 more forearms to the head, and Funker finally fell like a tree into the explosives below. Ba-boom! Ooh-ah! It was just as loud and just as scary as it had been in the outfield 7 hours earlier. Scarier, actually, because my idol was lying in the middle of 30,000 people with his body shaking and his arm badly burned. I knew that we shouldn't have allowed the extra explosives. I also knew that it would be my turn next. I brought Terry to the wire strands on his hands and knees. I draped him over and then took 2 steps back. I came with an elbow, but Terry moved out of the way, and I landed awkwardly on the wire with my back and triceps taking the brunt of the barbs. Terry picked me up and shot me into the wire. As I got closer, I became braver, to the point that I thought, I'm going to take the whole side out. I'd done this twice at Corkin Hall, and it was impressive, but injuries were likely. I didn't really care at this point. I was pretty banged up already. As it turned out, the point was moot. The wire was strung so well that my entire body barely even made it sag. Oh, it ripped me up all right. It just didn't look very good. The move brought Terry some time, however, and when I got up, another explosive board was in center ring, and Terry was waiting with a hip toss. Ba-boom! Ooh-ah! Wait, what's this? I thought. I'm not even really hurt. Apparently, I had been rolling with the hip toss, and in the split second between impact and detonation, I had narrowly avoided most of the explosion. Terry stayed on me and threw me outside. After a brief foray into the fans, he threw me back in the ring, and after a flurry of punches, hooked on the dreaded step-over toe hold. Actually, it's only dreaded in Japan. If you tried putting it on this ancient, boring maneuver in the States, you might find yourself out of a job. The hold was so over in Japan, however, that people lost their minds. Then, just when things looked their worst, my savior, the tiger, came to my rescue. He stopped Terry with the butt end of his sword while I sat up at another board in the corner. Side by side, like the true teammates we were, we threw Terry into the corner. Ba-boom! Ooh-ah! Terry was entangled in the wire and in a bad way at the 9-minute mark. We had 1 minute until the ring was set to explode. My heart was racing as we faced the moment of truth. Tiger retreated to the back as I attempted pinfall after pinfall. Finally, when the announcer started his 10-second countdown, I slid underneath the wire to watch this tremendous spectacle from outside the ring. 8, 7, 6. Terry tried to stand but fell back down. The fans were screaming his name. 5, 4, 3. No matter what happened or how long it took, I was going to have Terry kick out of my pin attempt. He would be known forever as the guy who kicked out of the ring explosion. 2, 1. I covered my ears. Here it comes. The 4 explosions that went off looked like Roman candles. My old neighbor Mark Forte had put on a better fireworks show in his backyard in '76. The fans didn't just fart on it, they looked as if they'd just smelled a giant fart. I felt the whole match slipping away. Terry just stood up with his arms out to his side as if to say, "Hey, it's not my fault." I tried my best to think of a way to save the match and came up with only one solution. Terry had the same idea. Injuries were about to pile up. I stepped inside the ring and Terry was there. I put on a sloppy headlock that was really just a setup and waited for Terry to counter. He lifted me slowly in the air in classic funk style and dropped me backward on the remaining explosive board. Ba-boom! Ooh-ah! And ooh-ah! The third sound was me screaming. I had landed in such a way that Terry's damn middle explosives had gone off directly underneath my arm. I felt like I'd been shot. I should have stayed down forever, but I was so hurt and scared that I popped right up. Terry stayed down. A portion of the explosion had caught under his right triceps, and he was in considerable pain. I called to the outside and looked under the ring for something to play with. I saw a toolbox and a stretcher, but pulled out a ladder instead. I rolled into the ring and I shouldered the ladder lengthwise. As Terry turned, I charged him, and the impact to his head was so severe that I felt somewhat guilty. I got over it. I set up the ladder to the side of the fallen funker. He was too close to land on, so I gave him a boot that moved him over. I ascended to the 5th step, about 6 feet in the air. The blood was really flowing from a cut in my hairline. It was so thick that it resembled more of a solid mask than a liquid. A friend of mine who had been a photographer for baseball for a decade later said that even though she didn't like blood, she thought my photos were beautiful in an artistic way. I stepped from the ladder and dropped a perfect elbow on Terry. Terry was really hurting now. As I rolled off him, I could see the anguish in his eyes. I tried to talk to him, but his mumbling was incoherent. I climbed the ladder again, but as I approached the 5th step, Terry got up and fell onto the ladder. I felt like the guy in the old F Troop fort, as I felt the ladder tipping. I had talked with Terry earlier about doing this, but had actually envisioned myself sailing over the sharp wire and crashing down onto the floor. Well, the good news is I didn't crash onto the floor. The bad news is I did fall into the barbed wire, and the consequences were steep. I opened up an angry gash on my right hand and a huge gash that almost cost me my good ear. It took me quite a while to get up, and when I did, Terry still wasn't moving. He was still down on his back and was obviously too hurt to continue. I crawled over and draped my arm over him for a somewhat anticlimactic victory. The audience was confused, but not disappointed. I'll just read it again. I had wrestled way too long and hard that day for my victory to be questioned. I was the king of the death match. Cameras flashed continually for the next several minutes as the press followed my every move. I tried to shake Terry's hand in accordance with Mr. Asano's wishes, but he was hustled out by the young boys before I got the chance. I was handed a huge trophy, which I held overhead for all the Kawasaki to see. I put the trophy down and haven't seen it since. While I celebrated, Terry was placed in an ambulance and rushed to the hospital. It was a truly touching scene as the adoring crowd reached out just to touch him and chanted his name. Terry had done me a gigantic favor. Terry had not only lost a couple of matches in the last decade in Japan, and a victory over the Funker was a huge milestone. Terry Funk, who had spent his entire career giving, had just given me a hell of a gift. I guess after all those years, maybe he really did see shit in me after all. I walked slowly back to the dugout area that had led to the dressing room. Before entering, I stepped onto one of the alternate rings and delivered a final bang bang. I walked to the empty concession area where I saw Mr. Asano. He was beaming, and rightfully so. This had been a huge success for his little promotion. I was covered in blood from head to toe, and I had literally risked my life for his company. I thought he would surely recognize this. Asano-san, I said, adding the san to his name as a sign of respect. Big house today. Maybe Tsukoshi bonus? Asano smiled his $500 million smile at me as he put his 100 yen coin into the soda machine. Cactus, he said, his hand now reaching for the frosty beverage. Ha ha, here bonus. I don't know where the $300 I earned that day went, but I do know where my bonus went. I brought it unopened back home where it now occupies a place of honor in my bathroom closet. I don't want to showcase it too much, but I do want to be able to look at it every now and then as a reminder of my past. I answered questions for the Japanese media while they took careful inventory of my injuries. They photographed my ear, my hand, my eye, and my head. Strangely, I hadn't thought much about my arm since the explosion, although it did seem to bother me. When the media left, I was practically alone. I had time to think about what had just gone on in the stadium and just what the kids would think when they saw their battered Big Daddy O stumble in the front door. After careful reflection, I had the sudden revelation that maybe I too needed some medical attention. When I walked out the door, the screaming fans were gone. The ambulance was history. Only Masa, a faithful Tonto to my Kimosabi, had stayed behind. He explained that everyone had gone and that he'd made sure I got back to Tokyo. We were in luck also, as the hospital was less than a mile away. So without a trophy, but with my head held high, the king of the death match walked to the hospital with his sidekick Masa. I was stitched up in the same room as Terry. He took some stitches in his head, and his triceps area was badly burned. I took 7 stitches in my hand, 9 in my eyebrow, 11 in my head, and 14 behind my ear. Once again, I failed to acknowledge the injury to my arm, even though it was now throbbing with pain. When I returned to the Ikebukuro section of Tokyo, I phoned home and blatantly lied to Colette by telling her I was fine. A little banged up, hun, but nothing serious. I then had a small dinner with Masa and headed to my room to count t-shirt money and eat ice cream in bed. I arrived at the Tokyo airport the next morning and waited to board. I heard my name called and walked to the boarding desk. Mr. Foley, a woman explained, you have been upgraded. I didn't know what to think. I'd been upgraded without asking. I thought about it while I sat in my wide, comfortable business class seat and concluded that they must simply have felt sorry for me. We took off for JFK, and the woman next to me started to wriggle. She tried not to look at me, and when she did, she was clearly uncomfortable. I tried to put myself in her shoes, and the situation became a little clearer. I had prominent stitches in my eyebrow and head. My right cheek was a deeply swollen purple, and I had my left ear bandaged with gauze. To make matters worse, because of the stitches, I couldn't shower, and my hair was particularly matted with dried blood. The dried blood was flaking and falling in small chips onto my shoulder. And to top it all off, my right arm, which I finally deduced had been burned by the explosion, was now turning brown. The poor lady excused herself to go to the restroom, and oddly, after an hour, had not returned. I looked around and saw her in the distance, resting comfortably somewhere in the vicinity of 21C. This woman had paid a great deal of extra money to sit in business, but had made a conscious decision to sit in coach rather than be next to me. I kind of like that. When I landed at JFK, my dad was there to pick me up. I shook his hand, and he guessed correctly that the previous evening had been a rough one. I deliberately kept my right arm, which was now a crusty brown, away from him. I stepped into our rented house in West Babylon, and I was met by a big reaction of, Daddy, Daddy, Daddy. Colette gave me a hug and quickly said, What's burning? I played dumb, but Colette persisted. God, Mick, that's bad. Was someone smoking next to you on the plane? But this time I was twisting into some strange positions to keep my wife, children, and father from seeing my arm. I swear I hadn't fought so hard to keep my high school mohawk from being seen. My dad said goodbye, and when he stepped out the door, Colette was on me again. Can't you smell something burning, Mick? It's awful. I finally answered. Yes, I do, Colette, I admitted as I turned my right arm to my wife. It's me. Chapter 30. I was home for less than 24 hours before I flew to Las Vegas for an independent match with Sabu. I wrapped my arm as if I were Boris Karloff in The Mummy, but midway through the match my mummification came undone. As the gauze unraveled, so did my brown, crusty skin, leaving me with a bright pink arm from my wrist to my shoulder. At the time, I thought for sure the scarring would be permanent, but due to proper wrapping and dressing, the results are barely noticeable. The next day, I had a match outside Pittsburgh, more unraveling and more exfoliating. Afterward, I ran into some of the World Wrestling Federation guys in the hotel. They were in town for the next day's SummerSlam and actually seemed happy to see me. The next day, there were rumors circulating that Cactus Jack would be doing a run-in at SummerSlam. On the plane ride home, a flight attendant looked at my arm and requested that I put on my sweatshirt out of respect for the other passengers. I arrived home and 4 days later was summoned to ECW headquarters for some interviews. Actually, ECW headquarters was the basement of the company's cameraman, where amid a rundown toy train and some hanging laundry, many of the ECW's finest moments were filmed. Much of the time, Joey Styles live at the ECW arena was actually Joey Styles in front of a banner hiding an old washer and dryer. Still, for some reason, I found it an inspiring place, and I needed inspiration to explain my diabolical turn on poor Tommy Dreamer. Actually, I thought about interviews all the time. Colette would often see me either zoning out or physically shaking, and she knew that I was cutting a promo. We would go to Armitage Gym, and she would catch me standing alone for minutes. While others were lifting and posing, I would be physically shaking as the power of the promo coursed through my veins. "Are you doing interviews?" she would say and break me from my trance. I didn't get any stronger at the gym, but I sure did think of cool stuff to say. As Dusty had advised me, I never actually practiced those thoughts. I just kept them in my brain for future reference. The words usually went directly from my heart to my mouth, and the results the past year have been tremendous. But turning heel in part of the country in which I had been loved for years was a difficult trick to pull off. I remember what Freebird Michael Hayes had told me about being an effective heel. In my mind, a heel has to feel his actions are justified. It doesn't matter how far out his motives, as long as he feels he's right. I've been thinking about psychology and criminal deviance, what makes a warped mind snap. Many of my favorite books were crime dramas, and I especially enjoyed reading about what traumatic event had set the wheels in motion. I like to refer to Robert De Niro's Max Cady in Cape Fear as my favorite heel. In many ways, he wasn't a heel at all. He was a man who had been wronged and went about seeking his own form of vengeance. Max was tough, intense, and filled with testicular fortitude. The babyface of the movie, Nick Nolte, was wishy-washy and weak. My favorite scene in any movie, besides Reed Rothschild asking how much you squat in Boogie Nights, is when Nolte hires three men to rough up Caddy and then hides behind a dumpster to watch his plan unfold. Caddy takes a hell of a beating at the hands of a baseball bat, a pipe, and a bicycle chain, but he makes a comeback nonetheless. As the heel stands bloody and battered and delivers the classic line, come out, wherever you are," the babyface is breathless and cowering. The line between good and bad had never been so thin. I wanted to walk that line with Tommy Dreamer. All I needed was a reason. I thought about the bloodthirsty ECW fans. I thought of how tough it was to please them and how important it was to Tommy to do so. I remembered a story about Tommy turning down a WCW offer because he wanted to be hardcore, and I wondered if maybe I should have kept shut my mouth and kept covering my $3,000 a week. I looked at my arm, which was still raw, and the scars from my stitches that had been removed. Then I thought about the months-old sign in the stands and how it had made my wife's stomach turn. A light bulb went off on in my head. I had found my reason. Colette and the kids came with me to the cameraman's house. I'd been through hell and back and was planning on taking a small vacation to relax. Colette dropped me off at the house and took the kids to a nearby park. When she returned an hour later, I was soaked with sweat and in a state of exhaustion. I had also left some pretty heavy thoughts in my wake. I still consider one of them to be among the 3 best things I've ever done in the business. This is a transcript from August 1995 ECW television show. I'm going to take you back to a very deciding point in my life, a time when I believed in something, a time when I thought that my face and my name made a difference. Do you remember the night, Tommy Dreamer? Because it's embedded in my skull, it's embedded in my heart, and it's embedded in every nightmare that I will ever have. As Terry Funk took a broken bottle and began slicing and dicing Cactus Jack, the pain was so much that I'll be honest with you, Tommy. The pain was so much that I wanted to say, "I quit, Terry Funk. I give. I wave the flag, and I'm a coward. Just please don't hurt me anymore." Then I saw my saving grace. You see, Tommy, I looked out in that audience, my adoring crowd, and I saw 2 simple words that changed my life. Kane Dewey. Somebody had taken the time and the effort and the thought to make a sign that said Kane Dewey. And I saw other people around as every moment in my life stopped and focused in on that sign, and the pain that shot through my body became a distant memory, replaced by a thought which will be embedded in my skull until my dying day. Kane Dewey. Kane Dewey. Dewey Foley is a 3-year-old little boy, you sick sons of bitches. You ripped out my heart. You ripped at my soul. You took everything I believed in and you flushed it down the damn toilet. You flushed my heart. You flushed my soul. And now it sickens me to see other people making the same mistake. You see, Tommy Dreamer, I have to listen to my little boy every day. "Daddy, I miss Georgia." And I say, "That's too bad, son, because your dad traded in the Victorian house for a sweat box on Long Island. Your dad traded in a $100,000 contract, guaranteed money, insurance, respect, and the name on the dotted line of the greatest man in the world to work for a scumbag who operates out of a little pissant pawn shop in Philadelphia. You don't expect me to be bitter? Tommy, when you open up your heart, When you open up your soul and it gets shit on, it tends to make Jack a very mean boy. And so I say to you, before I take these aggressions out on you, to look at your future and realize that the hardcore life is a lie. That these letters behind me are a blatant lie. That those fans who sit there and say, he's hardcore, he's hardcore, he's hardcore, wouldn't piss on you if you were on fire, you selfish son of a bitch. But I want you to understand, Tommy. Though he's hurt you time and time again, Raven wants you to understand that the hatred I have in here is not for you. No, no, far from it. You see, Tommy, I'm not doing this because I hate you. I love you, man. I only want the best for you. But when I hear what WCW called up your number and you said, no, thank you, well, it makes my blood run cold as that night in the ECW arena. And so I got a moral obligation. You see, Tommy, I'm on the path of righteousness, and religious men wield a lot of power. So I've got to drag you down by your face to that telephone and dial collect and say, hello, Eric. It's me, Cactus, and though I know I've burned my bridge and I'll never be taken back with open arms, I've got a wrestler who would gladly trade in his ECW shirt for a pair of green suspenders. And Tommy, just think of that sound in your ear when Uncle Eric says, welcome home, Tommy Dreamer. Welcome home. The response to the interview was overwhelming. Many longtime fans thought it was the best interview of all time. More important, it was accomplishing its goal, to get Tommy over. Tommy was now seen as the underdog, standing up for his hardcore beliefs against the evil empire, WCW, and its evil emperor, Bischoff. Bischoff was the perfect heel. ECW fans hated both WCW and the World Wrestling Federation, but at least they respected Vince. Bischoff was reprehensible. To them, Bischoff was nothing but a pretty boy whose goal in life was to lure away ECW talent with promises of big money and better recognition. Come to think of it, he did lure away a lot of ECW talent, and they did get big money and better recognition. Paul E. loved it. That was part of the beauty of ECW. The freedom led to greater creativity. In my time there, I was free to speak about anything I wanted in any way I chose. I was even free to blast the company and Paul E. himself. Later, Vince McMahon would tolerate and then encourage the same behavior, but at the time, it was unusual. The only casualty in all this was the poor sign guy. He took it hard and blamed himself. Stevie Richards saw him in the gym and thought he was beside himself with guilt. I thought he knew it was a joke, he moped to Stevie. I eventually mended fences with the guy, but to this day I don't think he realizes that he actually did me a favor. I knew I was onto something and I wanted to keep the ball rolling. I needed more inspiration, and I thought of all the wrestlers who looked to me as their role model and had hurt themselves as a result. Actually, this is still happening, especially with the proliferation of backyard wrestling leagues. I guess because I got my big start by jumping off Danny Zucker's roof, these kids look to me as some sort of guru. As an added bonus, they throw in barbed wire and thumbtacks to honor their hero. I got a letter yesterday from an aspiring wrestler who claimed he was ready to die for the World Wrestling Federation. He was 18 and said I could recognize him on the videotape he sent me as the one covered in blood. I'm going to write him a letter back and tell him that I won't even watch his tape until he finishes college. Maybe I should make something clear to prospective wrestlers. Promoters are not impressed by breaking tables, chair shots, and barbed wire. The secret is to learn the basics, develop a character, and work your ass off. Sure, I got my foot in the door by jumping off a roof, but it took me 6 years before I started out earning the guy who works the Slurpee machine at 7-Eleven. Besides, there are roof jumpers everywhere these days. Nobody cares about wild moves these days. They care about the guys who do them. Otherwise, Papi Chulo would be on the cover of TV Guide instead of Steve Austin. The Undertaker gets more reaction by diving over the top rope twice a year than Taka Michinoku does doing a twisting Sukahara every night. I myself get a better reaction by pulling a dirty sweat sock out of my shorts than I ever did by dropping elbows on the concrete. Also, with Ultimate Fighters, Olympic wrestlers, pro football players, and legitimate badasses becoming more and more prominent in the business, you really ought to have some amateur experience. As a general rule, the top guys hate hardcore wrestlers. If you show up in the World Wrestling Federation courtesy of a video full of broken tables and barbed wire, a guy like Ken Shamrock will send you back to your trusted backyard with your ball bag in a sling. Trust me, go to college, learn the basics, and break a table after the fans have already started caring about you. Hey, I didn't mean to go off on a tangent, but I've got to keep my conscience clear. I decided to keep up the pressure on Tommy, continuing to tell the truth about the ECW fans, apply even more WCW pressure, and up the moral ante. I like the idea of being on a religious mission. After all, no one likes a zealot. I also wanted to give some historical background on my earlier hardcore ambitions. The interview I cut a few weeks later was right up there with Kane Dewey. It also showcased how surprisingly sexy I looked in black leather. This is from September 1995 ECW television show interview. You know, I'd like to apologize for my behavior. I'm embarrassed. Certainly I feel a little stupid about the way I acted on this show a few weeks ago. It's just that I get a little emotional when I talk about wrestling because wrestling's been my livelihood for the past 10 years. It's enabled me to live out my childhood dream. So for me to come on a show such as the ECW television program and badmouth the wrestlers there, well, I'm sorry. But I think that in order to understand what's going on around my head, you have to understand where I come from and see what my goals were when I got into wrestling. See, back in 1985, there was a program called 2020 that challenged the wrestling industry, which kind of portrayed it in a negative light. Tommy, if you're listening, try to understand that I was the biggest wrestling fan in the world. And for me to stand in front of that television set and see people running down a business that I loved and held dear, even though I knew very little about it, to see my friends laughing at me saying, "That's what you want to get involved in?" That night I went to bed not with visions of sugar plums dancing through my head, but of broken bones, of battered bodies and bloody corpses, saying to myself, if it's the last thing I do, if I have to hold myself up for a human sacrifice, the world will respect professional wrestling. Oh, and that dream came true. Yes, I've sacrificed myself for the past 10 years, leaving the better parts of my past lying on concrete floors from Africa to Asia to South America to right in the middle of the ECW arena. And what's it really done? Where have we really come to? Lying in a hospital bed in Munich, Germany, seeing my ear being thrown into a garbage can, not being able to take it on the trip back because I didn't know the German word for formaldehyde, and having a nurse walk into my room looking at that piece of my body that's lying on the bottom of the garbage and saying, "Es alles Schauspiel," which means, "It's all a big joke." Excuse me! I didn't know you opened up the diseased lung of a smoker and said, "Oh, by golly, I thought smoking was supposed to be good for you. I thought smoking was supposed to be good for you." Do you open up Terry Funk's now non-functioning liver and say, "Hey, I didn't know that 4 decades of heavy drinking took this kind of toll"? Not true, but poor Terry got a lot of sympathy for it. So they show that much respect for other patients. What made me any different? Because I was a wrestler, and professional wrestling will never be respected. No matter how many teeth I lose, no matter how many ears I lose, no matter how many brain cells have to die. And so it comes down to the point where it's just not worth it. It's not worth it. And Tommy Dreamer, you've got to start looking at this realistically. Wrestling is a way to make a living. Nothing more and nothing less. And as long as it's strictly business, well, you may as well be cuddled in the welcoming arms of World Championship Wrestling, because ECW fans will be the death of you. You see, they realize, and they were smarter than any of us, that they rule ECW Wrestling, not us. What happened, Tommy? You came back from All Japan Wrestling with your trunks and your boots and said, "By golly, I'm really going to wrestle." Did Giant Baba hand you a dozen eggs and say, "Here, crack these on Jumbo Tsuruda's head"? You're a disgrace to the profession, Tommy. You're becoming a damn fool. And I can't sit back and take it because I've got a moral obligation. Tommy, try to understand. I am but a failed experiment in human sociology, and I can accept that. But never in my sickest dreams did I imagine that there would be other wrestlers taking dives on the concrete floors, committing human suicide on my behalf, like I'm the patron saint of all the sick sons of bitches. Is that all I stand for, Tommy? Is that all I stand for, to stand in an arena where JT Smith lands headfirst on the concrete and hear the fans yell, "You fucked up! You fucked up!" Well, fuck you! Who the hell do you think you are? We're not a wrestling organization anymore. We're the world's damn biggest puppet show. I'll be damned if I'm going to walk into an arena and let any of you call my match. 1, 2, 3, jump! 1, 2, 3, jump! Well, not me, because I'm nobody's stooge. And Tommy Dreamer, if you had a little bit of pride or a little bit of common sense, you'd understand that those people don't love you. They laugh at you. You took some of the worst beatings the sport's ever seen, and they still laughed in your face. And to think that I stood there with my arm around you and endorsed you, saying, "He's hardcore! He's hardcore! He's hardcore!" And for that, I deserve to die a terrible, painful death, Tommy, because I feel responsible. And I go to bed at night, and I'm not sure where I'm going to spend my eternity. And you, Tommy, are my salvation. Because by delivering you to a better organization where you can be appreciated, loved, and held with just the littlest amount of respect in the Turner family, then maybe there's a chance for me too. Please, Tommy, for my sake, think it over, because a yes to Cactus Jack would mean a great deal to me, and a no, well, I'd have to take that as you're putting a big A-OK stamp of approval on my eternal damnation. I'm counting on you, you selfish little prick. Don't make me hurt you, because I can. Don't make me do it, because if I do, with God as my witness, it won't be in front of those little scumbags at the ACW arena. It'll just be me, you, Tommy, and you won't know when it's coming, and you won't know where. So unless you want to damn me to the depths of hell, answer my call and say, "Okay, Cactus, you win." I'll put on my suspenders, I'll groom that mustache, and I'll call Uncle Eric and say, "Count me in." Because not only would you be doing yourself a big favor, not only would you be helping your life, you'd be saving mine. You'd be saving mine. My plan had holes in it, however, because my first series of matches found me on the receiving end of as many cheers as boos. Also, my t-shirts were still selling well, despite the fact that I'd formally torn our new friends a new bunghole. I thought real hard about it and realized the factors that I'd failed to consider. The fans already knew they were bloodthirsty, uncaring SOBs and enjoyed the acknowledgement. I talked about all my hardcore regrets, but then still wrestled in a hardcore style. I gave great anti-hardcore promos, but did them so well that they came off as hardcore. In essence, I was giving hardcore promos about not being hardcore. A drastic problem like this required a drastic solution. I drew up an emergency three-point plan. 1. Shift WCW praise into overdrive. 2. Don't be quite so angry in interviews. And 3. Under no circumstances give the fans a match that they could respect. Number 3 was the key. Out went the chair shots, elbows, in-crowd fighting, punching, kicking, headbutting, suplexing, slamming, or anything else that could be considered as entertaining. In come the headlocks. Long headlocks. Lots of headlocks. Boring headlocks. Lots of long, boring headlocks. I was going to stink up every gym and arena I came into contact with. And not only that, I was going to brag about it as well. I would openly claim that I was going to have bad matches, and then I would. I had a match with a guy called Puerto Ricano, Babu from World Wrestling Federation, that was so bad it was good. 10 full minutes of headlocks. I turned into other sterling performances as well. For 3 weeks I did my best to do my worst. My worst was pretty bad indeed. Todd Gordon and Paul Lee started claiming on television that I was stealing money from the company by wrestling so poorly. I shot back with a claim that as a former WCW star, I carried enough weight to do whatever I wanted. This got to Tommy Dreamer, who claimed he was going to beat the hardcore out of me. To do so, he even brought back my nemesis Terry Funk to be in his corner. After Kawasaki, Terry's body was so worn out that he needed time to heal and hadn't been to the arena in a while. The match to settle this strange score was set for October 28th. What began as a goofy concept very nearly ended in tragedy. ECW calls its annual November show the November to Remember. I later joked that this was the October to forget. The match opened with Tommy slapping me repeatedly and daring me to retaliate. I wouldn't. He slapped me again. I wouldn't. He slapped me one more time, and finally I couldn't take it. I reared back with my left hand and put on a headlock. The fans were very vocal in their dissatisfaction. Dreamer fought up, but I took him down again. Hey, by this point I knew my headlocks. He got up and stopped me and threw me to the floor, hoping the change in scenery might spark my hardcore memory. It did. I fired at Dreamer to the crowd's approval. I had Dreamer reeling, and knowing he was about to fall, I reared back and put on a headlock. This was great stuff. Finally, Tommy mounted an offense and forced me to retaliate. I did. I threw the blatantly brown-nosing bastard to the concrete and stepped through the ropes to the familiarity of the ring apron. I put up the arm, and the ECW faithful knew just what to expect. The legendary madman Cactus Jack was about to drop the legendary elbow. Except I didn't. Instead, I dropped in mid-stride and led a WCW cheer by spelling out the letters of the company with my arms. WCW! 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 It was more than Dreamer could stand. It made his hardcore blood boil. As the self-billed innovator of violence, Tommy had done some pretty neat tricks up his sleeve, and he started using them on me in great volume. I was taking a little bit of a beating and decided that in the immortal words of Owen Hart, enough is enough. It's time for a change. If Tommy wanted to get hardcore, I was going to show him how it was done. Unfortunately, this was what resulted in the previously mentioned failed eyebrow experiment. With Tommy's face lumpy and red from my errant blows, I reared back for the big one. Actually, this was going to look like a big one. I thought he had punched enough already. I threw the haymaker and howled in pain. Ow, I yelled. It's my hand. I think I broke my hand. I got on the house mic and addressed this serious health issue. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, I suffered tremendous damage to my hand, and as a result, I just can't go on. The pain is too great. I'm truly sorry, but I'm afraid that this match is over. The bout will be ruled a no contest. Referee John Milano's voice stopped me. Cactus Jack, this is ECW. There's no such thing as a no contest. I thought about that and came up with a solution. Then do your job and count me out, I countered. Milano was feeling daring. He got on the mic and said, Cactus, why are you being such a pussy? Whoa, hold on there, Jim. Pussy is a fighting word. Chuck Cheeseman had proved that in the Chris Anderson altercation back in '77. Still, it wasn't strong enough. I continued my walk to the back. With Milano's not counting, out came Bill Alfonso, better known as Fonzie. No, not the Fonzie who made up a story about having relatives in Waukesha because he was too proud to accept Richie's invitation to have Christmas dinner with Mr. C. No, not the Fonzie who's crashed into the chicken stand outside of Arnold's messed up his confidence so bad that he almost never rode his bike again. No, not the Fonzie who had to break it off with Pinky because he didn't want to go through life as Mr. Tuscadero. This Fonzie was a referee who had earned the hatred of the fans by actually enforcing the rules. Fonzie had only 3 teeth in his mouth and they were rotten, but he was a hell of a referee and he had the Pennsylvania State Rulebook in his hands. Fonzie got on the mic and in his high-pitched, whiny nails on chalkboard voice pleaded my case. Not only is it in the Pennsylvania State Rulebook, but it is Cactus Jack's constitutional right to be counted out if he so desires. 1, 2, 3, 4. The fans were getting hot as this was shaping up to be the worst ECW main event since Cactus vs. Drake. 5, 6, 7. Funk had seen enough. If you count one more number, the Funker warned, then I'm going to knock your goddamn dick in the dirt. Fonzie looked at the washed-up Texan and spoke his mind. I'm not afraid of the fans. I'm not afraid of Tommy Dreamer, and I'm certainly not afraid of you, Terry Funk. It's Cactus Jack's constitutional right to be counted out, and I'm going to do it. Fonzie looked contemptuously at Funk and counted his constitutionally allowed count. 8. Bam! Down went Fonzie to a stiff left hand. Funk got on the mic and attempted to lure me into a fight using the same psychology he had used on Bullet Bob Armstrong. Cactus Jack, Terry bellowed. You're a goddamn coward, you son of a bitch. I remained in the back. Your wife is a whore. Still in the back. Your mother is a whore. Nothing. Your children are both whores. That should have done it, but nothing. I could not be broken. The Funker had one more ace up his sleeve. Bischoff is a homo. That did it. I was out from behind the curtain in a flash to defend my main man's honor. I meant business as I hit the ring, but as I got to the blasphemous Funk, Dreamer stepped in front of me and started peppering me with big rights. Bam, 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 bam. The crowd was exploding, and I was doing my best to make each one look its most devastating. Some people didn't seem to get the concept of the match and gave it low marks. I guess if they were looking at it as a standard match, it wasn't that good. But in my view, anytime you can get the ECW crowd oohing and awing and getting out of their seat in the final match using only punches, you're getting something right. At this point, Raven made his presence known by using a steel chair on both Funk's and Dreamer's backs. With Funk down, Raven pulled out 2 foreign objects, a 10-pound weight and a roll of athletic tape. Slowly, I lifted my foot while he taped the weight to the top of my boot. This was great. Unless the Funker was also doubling his Iron Balls McGinty, he was going to go down. Sure enough, I kicked a field goal with Terry's testes, and the wounded Texan was helped to the back. Tommy was all alone now and about to find out what hardcore was all about. Raven and I doubled on him until Funk miraculously returned, carrying his flaming branding iron. Raven and I peeled off Dreamer and fed Funk one by one for shots to the back and stomach. The arena was whipped into a frenzy. Our quest for righteousness was not to be denied, however, as referee Bill Alfonso, who had been taken to the back after suffering his one-punch knockout, reemerged with a weapon of his own. It was my own Japanese standby, the fire chair. I was handed the unlit chair and knocked Terry down with a nice shot to the head. Terry turned as well and was dropped with a crushing blow to the skull that was lessened only slightly by the kerosene-soaked towel. Raven touched Funk's iron to the towel, and the fire chair lived again in the ECW arena. I looked at Funk, who was flat on his belly. I raised the chair slowly and could feel the heat on my arms. As I came down with my swing, Dreamer made a dive for Funk and used his body as a shield to spare Terry the blazing consequences. The effect was awesome. Dreamer had seemingly risked his life to save the fallen Funker, and the crowd loved him for it. Everything was going great when I heard Terry's voice. Pick it up again, Terry mumbled in a voice so low that I could barely hear it above the roar of the crowd. Are you sure? I asked. Use it again, he reiterated. I picked up the fire chair and slowly raised it again. Terry was getting to his feet, and I stalled to give him more time. When he was fully standing, I slowly charged him with the chair. I could see he was bailing out of the ring, so I started a slow swing that I knew wouldn't come near him. All I wanted was to hit the ropes with the fire chair and give the impression that I was trying for Terry. Before my shocked eyes, I saw our plan fall to pieces. What appeared to be a giant fireball flew off the chair and instantly ignited Terry, who was bent over by the ring apron. My first thought was to save him. I completely abandoned my character and my storyline and dove through the ropes to try to put out Terry. I knew that flames had about 3 seconds of contact before they really did their damage. Terry was up to at least 2. I took off after Terry, but he was running like a madman. To this day, I try to relive these events in my mind and try to figure out why I couldn't catch him. Was he moving too fast to catch, or was I simply a coward under pressure? The question still haunts me. I do remember thinking, I've got to catch him, and then wondering, what do I do once I'm there? I had no answers. I wish I could point to a burn on my body and say, this is where I saved my hero Terry Funk, but all I had to show for it is a heavy conscience. I remember thinking, he's gone. Terry's gone, before fate or God or luck lent a hand. The fire seemed to roll off Terry's shoulders as if by magic, and Terry collapsed to the floor. In actuality, a fireball had not flown off the chair, and Terry himself had not become ignited. Instead, the towel that was on fire had flown off the chair and landed on his back. The towel had been burning, not Terry, although I'm sure that was small comfort to Terry as he was helped to the dressing room. When I got to the back, Terry was on a rampage. His right arm had been severely burned, and he was more than a little annoyed about it. The funker was throwing furniture, and there was some pretty tough guys cowering in fear of the ticked-off Texan and a host of flying chairs, fans, and tables. As I approached Terry, I could see that his wife Vicky was crying. Life is never easy for a wrestler's wife, but for Vicky, who had already seen her husband injured countless times, the night was especially traumatic. I didn't know what to say, and as it turned out, my choice of words was not all that comforting. Are you all right? I asked, and was met by a flying chair and a string of obscenities that even my dad would have envied. Goddamn motherfucker, there's no excuse for that shit, you son of a bitch! Again, my words were not all that soothing. Sorry, Terry. He looked at me with rage in his eyes. You damn well ought to be sorry, you son of a bitch! Vicky tried to calm him down, but it was no use, so she tried to calm me down instead. Terrence is just upset, she assured me in her West Texas drawl. Just go home. He'll be all right. I went home, but I was an emotional wreck. I swore to myself that I was going to quit wrestling, but by the time I reached Staten Island, I had decided that I just wouldn't wrestle in this country anymore. By the time I got home, I was thinking that we could probably cut some promos on each other over this. Still, I was very upset when I had told Colette about the night's events. Unbeknownst to me, Terry had checked out of the hospital later that night and come back to the arena to cut promos for the next month's match. If I had known, I probably would have slept a little better. The next morning, I made sure that I called Terry's house. I knew he wouldn't be home, but I wanted to make sure that my voice was the first one he heard when he turned on his answering machine. I went out for the day, and when I came home, he had left a message. I was relieved to hear that he wasn't yelling, but had gone back to the whisper mumble that I know so well. Hello, Cactus. This is Terry Funk, and I just wanted to say that I acted like a damn fool, and I'm sorry. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't anybody's fault. It just happened. God damn. We sure did give them something to talk about, didn't we? I'm sure people are going to be talking about this for a long, long time. Goodbye, Cactus Jack, and don't pay any attention to what I said last night. I'm just an old fool. I liked the message so much that I played it for Colette. I saw her eyes well up with tears as she listened to kindly old Uncle Terry. He really is a nice man, she said as she handed me the phone. I saved that message for a long time. We celebrated Halloween 2 days later. As for most holidays at the Foleys, we made a big deal out of Halloween. When I'm on the road, I try to build up certain events in the kids' minds as it seems to take the sting out of being gone so long. Guess where we're going when Daddy gets home was a familiar battle cry over the telephone. If I didn't have my little perks and special days for the kids to look forward to, I don't think I could last out there. I had always been a Halloween fanatic. When I was a kid, I used to start plotting my next year's costume as soon as the current Halloween was over. I tried to be creative and flat out refused to buy one of those cheap, ready-made costumes the other kids wore. It just seemed like you should have to strive a little more for the privilege of eating free candy. My brother didn't share my sense of theatrical importance. As a result, in every picture of us on Halloween, I looked cool and he looked like a doofus. My mom would never admit it, though. You both look great, she'd say, although photogenic evidence certainly seems to disagree with her. My kids could not, under any circumstances, look like doofuses on Halloween. I consider myself a pretty lenient parent, but sometimes a dad has to take a stand. Dewey was a huge Batman fan, and exactly as my mom had 25 years earlier, I would be summoned into the room to call the action as Adam West and Burt Ward laid the smackdown on all the villains' candy asses. Bam! Pow! Biff! Kapoof! I'd yell as my kids both threw kicks at imaginary bad guys. Dewey wanted to be Batman and Noelle wanted to be Batgirl, which was a dilemma because I knew that half of West Babylon would be wearing the cowl and cape. I was determined that my kids would have the best of all the costumes, so I special ordered some outfits from the lady who made my wrestling tights. Sure enough, my kids were the best looking Batman and Batgirl in town. And they weren't wearing the trendy new black outfit with the built in muscles either. No, my kids were wearing the classic Adam West blue and gray. The way it was meant to be, damn it. I may have a reputation for pinching pennies so hard that it makes Abe Lincoln scream, and in some cases rightfully so, but not when it comes to Halloween, or Halloween candy. My mother had long ago established a tradition of at least 3 quality fun-sized bars in each little Halloween baggie, along with an assortment of other little goodies. With the exception of the year that I slipped dried cat turds into little Babe Ruth wrappers and gave them to Jacqueline Miller, everybody came out a winner on All Hallows Eve at the Foleys. I had been carrying out that tradition for years. Anyone who came to the Victorian house in Georgia walked away a winner, and I was determined to continue that tradition at our sweatbox on Long Island. We prepared 36 bags and waited for the trickle of innocent toddlers to start coming by. It was more like a flood. The moment school let out, there were kids everywhere. A lot of the teenagers didn't even have costumes unless they were dressed up as pimply guys with bad haircuts. The candy was gone literally in 20 minutes. At least we broke even. When we trick-or-treated that night, we went so damn far into the immense neighborhood that by the time we were done, the kids had been asleep in the stroller for an hour. Colette or I would just knock on a door and point to the stroller and accept a single piece of candy on behalf of our sleeping kids. I will always treasure that Halloween, especially a picture taken the night before when the kids had worn their costumes to Grandma and Grandpa's house. We had bought Dewey a pair of imitation snakeskin boots at a second-hand store a week earlier, and Dewey thought those boots went with everything. They didn't. I guess that's the reason Adam West never went western while laying the smackdown. because if he had, he would have looked like my son. Despite all my great intentions, hopes, and ambitions, my son did indeed look like a doofus. I think my affection for the holidays has played a part in the struggle with my weight. I just seem to associate food with happy memories and happy memories with food. If I were to play a word association game with special memories, I would look almost automatically answer with the food that it reminded me of. Birthday, cake. Christmas, cookies. Halloween, pumpkin pie. 4th of July, hot dogs. Baseball games with dad, peanuts. I had such a good time at Hershey Park with the kids a few years ago that I actually started eating Hershey bars with regularity. We returned to ECW Arena for the much anticipated November to Remember show that pitted Cactus and Raven against Funk and Dreamer. After the fire incident, many felt that ECW had finally crossed the line and there would be a backlash against the promotion. On the other hand, there were many who thought the match was the greatest thing they'd ever seen. There were actually chants of ECW while Terry was on fire. I ran into some fans a week after the incident who said, "Man, how'd you do that stunt with the fire? That was great." Unfortunately, wrestling has become so good at creating the illusion of disaster that when disaster does hit, it's very difficult to tell the difference. Sadly, when Owen Hart died in the ring during a World Wrestling Federation pay-per-view, many initially thought it was just part of the show. I really wish it had been. The fact that the show went on and that the fans still enjoyed themselves and that I stood 2 feet from the spot where Owen died is something that I'm having a hard time dealing with. We made sure that November to Remember had some levity to it. The show had actually sold out faster than any other in ECW history, which seemed to rule out the idea of having gone too far. Still, we felt it was important that the brutality be toned down a little bit and that some fun be substituted instead. My pro WCW angle was really catching on. In honor of my former employers, I had some special ring attire made up for the showdown. On the surface, it was impossible to tell, but underneath the wanted shirt I had my secret weapon. Raven and I were having our way with our adversaries, with Funk catching a beating on the outside, with Raven and me putting the boots to Tommy. Tommy's face was a mask of pain as I worked him over. He didn't seem to have a chance. Suddenly, when things were looking bleakest, I pulled off the familiar black and gold cactus shirt. Underneath was the insult to end all insults, at least in the ECW arena. I was now sporting a beautifully airbrushed t-shirt featuring the Shark, John Tenta, Kamala, and the Zodiac the Butcher, the Booty Man, the Disciple, the Barber Brutus Beefcake. Collectively, they were known as the Faces of Fear, and although they were all individually nice guys, collectively their respect among the ECW fans was microscopic. In addition to the great artwork on the front, there were big Valentine on the back. It looked like something that a 12-year-old girl would wear to her first concert. I stood up and did a meandering circle so that the entire audience could see my horrible shirt. It was a great heat getter. Cheap heat, yes, but heat nonetheless. I went back to Dreamer, who had by this time seen the blasphemous artwork. I kicked him, but it didn't faze him. Another kick, but to no avail. A big punch, and he started shaking. Dreamer was now Hulk Hogan and was making a Superman comeback on the Turner-loving turncoat. He let loose with a barrage of punches and sent me down to the canvas with one of his violent innovations. He then ripped the offensive shirt right off my body. I stood up slowly and turned to the crowd. Immediately, they reacted. As I turned in my slow, tortuous 360, everyone learned the ugly truth but Tommy. Finally, as I completed my circle, Tommy spotted it, and his eyes grew wide. There it was. Compared to this, the Faces of Fear shirt had been nothing. Compared to this, Kamala, Shark, and Zodiac were hardcore warriors. On my shirt, in front of 1,200 bloodthirsty WCW-hating fanatics, I was sporting a lovingly created, painstakingly detailed image of Eric Bischoff. On the back was this simple wish: "Forgive me, Uncle Eric." It was almost as if Dreamer was Popeye and Bischoff was his spinach because Tommy kicked it into overdrive. Boom, 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 boom. Tommy was connected with solid rights. The crowd was eating it up. A few more punches and Dreamer was ready for the big one. He pulled my shirt up and stretched it over my head so that the WCW Boy Wonder's head completely covered mine. It was almost as if I was wearing a Bischoff mask. I weebled and wobbled inside that shirt as if it were a Rubbermaid while Dreamer selected the perfect chair. I could hear the crowd buzzing, and I could see the silhouette of the swinging chair as I waited for impact. Bang! I staggered and stumbled but didn't go down, although when I lifted my head, it magically appeared as if Bischoff himself had been busted wide open. Was it magic, or was it real? Only the people who watched Secrets of Pro Wrestling really knew for sure. I honestly can't remember who won the match that night, although the fact that I can't remember is a pretty good indication that I didn't. As a strange side note, I understand the Bischoff shirt from that show is now worth a huge sum of money. When I returned home, I received a phone call that was of great interest to me. Jim Ross was on the phone with the news that the World Wrestling Federation wanted to meet with me. Chapter 31. It had been about a year since I'd spoken to Jim Ross. Jim and I had remained in contact throughout our different trials and tribulations, but this had been the longest I'd gone without keeping in touch with him. Despite being the best play-by-play announcer in the game, Jim had been in and out of the World Wrestling Federation on several different occasions before finally coming back to stay. Oddly, one of the past differences between Jim and the Federation centered around his reluctance to don a cowboy hat and call himself JR. Coming from a Bill Watts background, Jim did not see announcers as being characters and had fought the idea. Upon his return, Jim finally donned the Stetson and became JR. It's funny, it's funny because now it's hard for me to imagine him without the damn hat, and even I refer to him as JR. Hell, he refers to himself as JR. Really, the hat just adds a little flavor and has in no way diminished his passion for the sport or his unique ability to make a bad match decent and a good match great. JR was now Vince's right hand man, so a call from him was no small deal. A year earlier, I had informed JR that I was working steadily, was having fun, and in no way needed a job. I also let him know that if the right job came about, I would be interested. JR's new call informed me that this might be the right job, and that Vince McMahon had a new idea and that he would like to set up a meeting. This was a top spot, he informed me, and would hopefully lead to a successful series of matches with The Undertaker. I had one question before I agreed to meeting. Jim, I asked, you don't tell everyone who comes in that they're being groomed for a top spot, do you? I mean, what did you tell Aldo Montoya when he came in? Aldo Montoya was a perennial Federation loser before he went on to stardom in ECW. Jim thought about it and came back with an answer. No, we don't, Cactus. If we say it's a top spot, we mean it. In Aldo's case, he was probably told that it was a good spot but not a great spot, and that there would be room for advancement if the character caught on. All right, I said. Let's set up a meeting. There was a lot of considerations to take into account at this time. I was making decent money in Japan, but my goodness, I was getting the hell beaten out of me. The Deathmatch tournament was not the last time I came home from Japan in a pretty bad way. Not by a long shot. The brutality was taking its toll not only on me, but on Colette as well, as she was beginning to fear a ringing phone for the bad news it might carry. I had been approached by Mr. Asano about coming back to Japan for 17 weeks during the next year. I was even offered a raise of $500 a week, up to $3,500 a week. But 17 weeks was really 170 days when you include travel, and a hell of a lot more than that when you figure in intangibles like jet lag. Also, without trying to sound like a big shot, I knew that my blood and sweat were worth more to the $500 million man than the 59 grand that he would be paying me. I would still be able to sell t-shirts, but that gravy train was showing signs of slowing down. I was a popular wrestler with enthusiastic fans, but our fan base was still rather small. Many of the fans who bought the wanted shirt already owned several of them. To stay ahead of the game, I had designed a few new t-shirts, but their designs included tactical errors that I could not have foreseen. One of them featured a silhouette of Cactus Jack against the red sun, with the Japanese writing King of the Deathmatch on the front and Born to be Wired in English on the back. Two problems. One, since the Japanese flag consists of a red sun, a newspaper reporter considered the design to show a lack of respect to the Japanese people. Two, for some reason, Japanese wrestling fans only want slogans that are written in English. Ironically, the ECW fans loved the Japanese writing. My second shirt was a winner in theory, but a flop in practice. O.J. Simpson's murder case was all over the news, and I figured I'd cash in on his international notoriety. I came up with an old-time wrestling card motif that billed a one-time only death match between Cactus and O.J., who was utterly nattily attired in his Buffalo Bills jersey and a bloody glove which held a bloody knife. Detective Mark Furman was slated as the special guest referee. I thought the Japanese fans would eat up a shirt featuring these two hardcore icons, with O.J. being a little more extreme than me. I think I sold 12 of them. So if OJ wants to sue me for royalties, well, he could have them. Japanese tradition has prided itself on honor for thousands of years, and going back decades, agreements with U.S. wrestlers were made on a handshake. I even asked Mr. Asano if he wanted to shake hands on the deal or sign a contract. He insisted on a contract. If we'd shaken hands, there was a chance that there would be no Mankind or Mr. Socko in the World Wrestling Federation, as I wouldn't have broken that agreement. With the exception of the fire incident, I was having a tremendous time in ECW. I got along with everybody. I was free to do whatever I wanted. Hell, I was even able to call the owner a scumbag and his place of business a pissant pawn shop. Unfortunately, many of the things I'd said of the ECW fans in interviews were true. They were demanding, bloodthirsty, and insensitive. I was also aware that my presence there, while valuable, was by no means a necessity, as the ECW arena sold out whether I was there or not. By this time, the ECW merchandise machine had started to roll out, and my wanted shirt was no longer the only quality item on the table. As a matter of fact, there were about 18 to choose from, and the fans were so passionate about this company that they usually chose an ECW shirt as opposed to that of an individual wrestler. I also found my stock dropping in other independent organizations. I had been off national television for over a year, and though I hate to admit it, many people had either forgotten about Cactus Jack or didn't care all that much. As a result, I had lowered my price, and once at the show, no longer sold the same quantities of merchandise. Polaroid business was slowing down as well, and while it never got close to the Gordy and Chattanooga level, there were many times where my ego took a beating. So I guess my decision to meet with World Wrestling Federation came down to two simple things: physical and financial well-being. The Federation at that time, however, was far from wrestling utopia. Crowds were down, morale was down, and paychecks were down. I had heard horror stories from the road about Canadian trips where guys hadn't even made enough to meet their road expenses. Wrestlers were at one another's throats, and there were deep divisions among groups of guys in the dressing room. Shane Douglas, who had left ECW months earlier, had high hopes of his World Wrestling Federation chances, was now miserable. Abort mission was one of Shane's more pleasant messages as he pleaded with his longtime friend not to follow down the same lamentable path that he had taken. In truth, Shane was at least partly to blame for his Federation woes, as he had let Vince change him from the dynamic, intense franchise into the monotone, drippy Dean. Now, don't get me wrong, a guy with a good vocabulary who thinks he's smarter than anyone can be annoying, but it was not exactly the type of thing that would inspire me to buy a ticket. Hey Jimmy, I was watching wrestling and there was this really smart guy on there. Let's go buy a ticket. Was not a conversation that I imagined kids around the world were having. No, I wasn't going to fall into that same trap that Shane had. I was too smart for that. Vince was going to get Cactus Jack the way I wanted him, or else, damn it, he wasn't going to get him at all. I drove to Stamford, Connecticut that day with lots of questions on my mind. In an uncanny coincidence, I was wearing the same sport coat that I had met Ted Turner in. Actually, maybe the coincidence wasn't quite that eerie, as it was the only sport coat I owned. This prospect of meeting Vince McMahon was definitely unnerving. This was the same guy that I had been watching since I was a kid, and he was definitely a larger-than-life character. In addition, Vince was the man responsible for starting the wrestling revolution in the mid-'80s. By combining a bold vision with a savvy marketing plan, Vince had gambled everything to turn his father's regional Northeast territory into an international powerhouse. His product had infuriated wrestling purists and most old-time promoters who felt that Vince had turned their beloved sport into a circus. He'd taken a low-class, vulgar, and bloody sport and turned it into a clean family entertainment. Under those conditions, Cactus Jack was not exactly the old Federation's cup of tea. Now, with business down and with society rejecting McMahon's dated vision, he was in the beginning stages of spicing up his product. In some ways, just bringing in Cactus Jack for a meeting was evidence of the Federation's new attitude. I walked into Titan Towers, an ominous-looking 8-story structure of glass and steel, and I was shown to Vince's office. This itself was a dubious distinction, as I had been told for years that if Vince really wanted to see you, he'd have you brought to his house. Still, at least I had a meeting with JJ effing Dillon. I swear Dorothy had an easier time getting an audience with the Wizard of Oz. Vince walked into the office looking fit and wealthy. I don't know if that's a proper way to describe a man, but that was the impression that I got. I'd met Vince fleetingly when I did my World Wrestling Federation matches in 1986, but this was over 9 years later, and if Vince had remembered our little encounter, he was doing a good job of hiding it. "Mike, how are you?" boomed the voice, the same voice that I had heard call so many matches from my childhood. Ooh, that wasn't a good sign. I hadn't been called Mike since the early 70s and didn't really enjoy it then. I didn't want to correct him, especially within the first 9 seconds of meeting. It would be almost like telling the president he had mustard on his chin. So instead of speaking up once and correcting this small inaccuracy, I allowed myself to be called the wrong name for 2 hours. Actually, other than the Mike thing, which we could work around, I hit it off well with Vince. So well, in fact, that we went over to his house, where I borrowed a pair of Vince's trunks and did cannonballs and belly flops into the McMahon pool while Vince flipped hamburgers on the grill. Okay, maybe not that well. Maybe there were no burgers, cannonballs, trunks, or a home visit, but at least we were cordial. Vince explained some of the company's past problems to me and how those problems had affected business. A federal steroid trial in particular had been especially damaging. Vince was eventually cleared of all charges, but the length of the trial, costs, and energy involved had badly damaged the company and its public perception. Vince told me the company had actually wanted to change gears and adopt a rougher style much earlier, but had found it necessary to maintain a clean image during the aftermath of the trial. Now he was ready to forge ahead, and the timing seemed right to bring in the hardcore legend. I guess I was lucky to have escaped the ECW curse, because it seemed that many of the ECW mainstays have floundered and looked out of their league when they jumped to the big two. Much of the time there is a stigma that surrounds them and a negative feeling toward them in the dressing room. Vince had sent out feelers, and I found that later had actually gotten positive feedback from some of his bigger stars like The Undertaker and Kevin Nash. Actually, it was The Undertaker who was most instrumental in my hiring, in more ways than one. I loved The Undertaker's character and had been a fan of it since its debut at the 1990 Survivor Series. I had actually known the Taker quite well and rode and roomed with him back in his mean Mark Callis days. Over the years since, I had run into him on the road a few times and had always been happy to catch up on old times. The Undertaker seemed to have suffered over the past few years, however, due to a lack of decent opponents who could generate interesting feuds. The Giant Gonzalez experiment in particular yielded some tough-to-watch matches. At 6'9" and over 300 pounds, Undertaker was one of the largest men in the business, but his last several years had been spent feuding with wrestlers who were either taller or heavier. With the exception of Yokozuna, who Taker had done big business with, none of these feuds was able to capture people's imagination. The idea that Vince was set to match Undertaker up with someone who could get inside his head and could threaten him mentally as well as physically. Vince assured me that his ambitions for this marriage by saying that my interviews would really put this thing over. He was so convincing in his accolades for Mike as both a wrestler and human being that I couldn't wait to become part of the World Wrestling Federation family, even if the money stank and the guys in the dressing room hated one another. Then Vince spoke again. "We've got a gimmick for you, Mike, and it involves putting you under a hood," Vince said with a big smile as I felt my heart sink to the bottom of my stomach. A hood was a mask, and outside of Mexico and Japan, a mask was a death knell for a career. Hell, a mask was something that underneath guys wore at center stage when they didn't want their friends and family to know they were losing on TV. I may have been in awe of Vince and willing to let him call me the wrong name, but this time I had to speak up. "Vince, I always felt that my facial expressions were part of my charm. Why would you want to cover me up?" It was then that Vince showed me a sketch of a hood that more closely resembled something from the man in the Iron Mask. The mask was actually an idea that was first brought up for The Undertaker after he had suffered a fracture of his orbital bone and needed a mask to protect his face. Instead of putting the Taker in a hockey mask, Vince had requested several ideas for a mask that would add to instead of detract from his image. The drawing I was shown was actually a reject from the Undertaker project that Vince had saved for future reference. Actually, my name had come up sometime later, and Vince thought that Mick Foley might have just found his niche in the World Wrestling Federation. I looked at the sketch and picked it up to study it more closely. The mask was actually quite a bit different from the one I would eventually wear. It definitely appeared to be made of metal, with small iron bars caressing my mouth. Hannibal Lecter style. I could see some possibilities in the sketch, but my heart was still feeling a little low in my gut. "Vince," I asked with confusion in my voice, "why can't I just be Cactus Jack?" Vince tried to be comforting, but failed miserably with his words. "Mike, you gotta understand that the average fan sees wrestling as a glut of performers who seem to blend together. It is hard for our licensees to get behind our products, and hard for us to push your character if there is no distinction between the competition and us. We feel that with this unique character, we can market Mike and make Mike a bigger star than he's ever been." His words made sense, and in retrospect, the marketing of Mankind has been a great success, but at the time I was thinking something altogether different. Not only did Vince not want the Cactus Jack I wanted to give him, he didn't want him at all. Poor Mike. He wasn't happy. Our meeting ended with me holding on to my sketch and trying to hold on to my lunch. I told Vince that I really liked his idea when actually I was secretly wishing that he had come up with an amnesia angle. JJ effing Dillon walked in and handed me a contract, which I took, but I was sure that I'd never sign. In addition, with the lame gimmick I'd been handed, the World Wrestling Federation contact called for no guaranteed money at all, just an opportunity. The opportunity may have seemed enticing back in the days when the wrestlers were on Saturday morning cartoons, but with the knowledge that Federation superstars were having trouble paying for their rooms in Red Deer, Canada, I began thinking that Mr. Asano's offer was not that bad after all. I arrived home and gave the news to Colette. Surprisingly, she liked the idea of the new character and began pointing out the possibilities. Colette has a creative mind, and as I mentioned, had been partly responsible for the Cactus Jack transformation from goof to monster back in 1990. She laid out some pretty wild images, and I began to see some possibilities. Then again, these thoughts were coming from a woman who thought Mick Foley was sexy, so how good could her opinion be? I thought about it for quite a while before calling up JJ effing Dillon. I thanked JJ for thinking of me and told him that I had enjoyed my visit to Stanford, but that I didn't think the idea would work and that I would go on living life as Cactus Jack. I've got to admit that part of me felt really good about me telling him that I wasn't interested in the World Wrestling Federation. A few hours later, I received a call from Jim Ross, who talked to me for 2 hours about my decision. He was honest about the pluses and minuses of the Federation and convinced me of Vince's sincerity in pushing the new character. I told him of my semi-commitment to Japan and of my desire to continue working in ECW until I actually began on television with the Federation. We worked out a deal where I would start on television after WrestleMania and I would begin a full-time schedule early in May. In the meantime, they would start airing vignettes to introduce their audience to this new character. I drove to New York City a few days later to be fitted for my mask. The mask maker was a peculiar little Orthodox Jewish guy named Stanley who operated out of his fifth-floor apartment. At first, I was driving around looking for a huge neon sign saying "Masks Are Us" or something similar, but I eventually made my way to his strange lair, where I was given hot herbal tea with honey before having plaster poured all over my face to make a mold for my mask. The concept for the mask had changed quite a bit in the last few days. Stanley explained that their sketch would never actually work directly, so he had modified it with hinges around the mouth. Thankfully, the Hannibal Lecter bars were gone from the mouth, as was the whole metal concept. Instead, it was a light brown rawhide leather mask with a mouth I could actually move. The almost black color that I now sport as a result of 3 years of sweating. Needless to say, wearing the mask is not the most pleasant experience in the world. I left Stanley's and headed several blocks away to the seamstress's office where an elaborate costume had been made. Afterward, I drove to Stanford for a follow-up with Vince. We talked at length about ideas for the character, and he seemed responsive to most of them. In some ways, I was actually looking forward to changing characters. It would give me a chance to grow and try out some new things. For one thing, I felt like I needed a new finishing move. The double-arm DDT was fine, but I wanted something more sinister. A long time ago, when I was flying onto the concrete and rolling guys onto the ring for the pin, I approached Jim Cornette about getting a new finish. I'm dying, Corny, I told him. I can't just drop elbows every night. Can you think of something that doesn't hurt me and doesn't require a whole lot of strength? One of the keys to a good finish is that you should be able to put it on anyone, anywhere, at any time. The Tombstone Piledriver, for example, was a move that The Undertaker had not been able to use in over 2 years because all his opponents were up in the 400-pound range. The Stone Cold Stunner, on the other hand, can be done all day long on any day to any guy. Cornette was like a wrestling encyclopedia, and if anybody could think of a simple, effective finish, it would be him. Cactus, he said, smiling. You ever heard of the mandible claw? I stood with Corny like a student looks to a teacher as Jimmy laid out not only the biomechanics and philosophy of the hold, but the history behind it as well. Cactus, Corny began. In the old Tennessee territory, there was a wrestler named Dr. Sam Shepard. He was the physician that the TV show and movie The Fugitive were based on. He was accused of killing his wife, and even though there were really weird circumstances surrounding the case, he was convicted and put in jail. Eventually, his verdict was overturned, but because of his notoriety, the poor guy couldn't work as a physician anymore. He went to work in a small southern wrestling circuit and, using his knowledge of the human anatomy, developed a finishing hold called the mandible claw. Cornette then proceeded to hold me how it worked. By pressing down with your two middle fingers on the nerves underneath the tongue, and by pressing up with your thumb on the nerves running under the chin, you can damn near kill the guy. You'd have a hell of a finish, and you wouldn't have to kill yourself. I was so excited that I ran right to the cowboy himself, Bill Watts. I laid it out and waited for his enthusiastic response and maybe even a manly hug. I got neither. Instead, I got, why couldn't I just bite your goddamn fingers off? I tried to explain the whole nerve idea, but it was no use. Bill had spoken. I decided to pitch my idea again to a more reasonable man who wouldn't talk about biting my goddamn fingers off. I relayed the historical significance and also tried to make him see just how visually exciting the whole thing would look. Vincent will be the only move in the business that will allow the camera to get close ups of both guys at the same time. It will be great. Vince thought about it for quite a while before answering. Mick, he began. Apparently, someone must have alerted him about the same issue. Name issue. Why wouldn't I just bite your fingers? Oh no, I was sunk. Or was I? I had to fire back, or else the moment would be gone forever. Because, I began my rebuttal, it's a nerve hold. No one can bite when the hold is applied. We can have the announcers talk about the element of surprise and how once it's on, the match is over. Vince took it all in and nodded. Let me think about it, is all he said. I also had an idea for music. I loved a particular scene in The Silence of the Lambs that had a tremendous juxtaposition of violence and beautiful music. The scene took place in a temporary cell built in the court building of Memphis, Tennessee. As it begins, Hannibal Lecter is listening to a tape of beautiful piano music as he uses the commode. Unknown to the police officers guarding him, Lecter is in possession of a small piece of metal, which he hides between his fingers. The police officers approach the cage with his dinner, saying, Okay, you know the procedure, Doc. Grab some floor. Lecter sits with his back to the bars and allows himself to be handcuffed with his hands behind his back. Once he is incapacitated, the officers unlock the cage to lay his dinner on the table. During this food delivery, Lecter is working on the handcuffs with his small piece of metal. When the first officer comes near, Lecter springs into action, snapping one cuff on one of the officer's wrists, rendering him immobile while snapping the other on one of the cell bars. When the second officer comes for assistance, Lecter bites off a portion of the man's tongue and thoroughly maces his eyes. He then returns to the helpless first officer and, as dramatic music blares, methodically caves in his skull with several blows from the man's own nightstick. The camera then surveys the bloody aftermath as the beautiful piano music gently fades back in. A blood-splattered Lecter is shown to be the picture of serenity as he gently sways to the beautiful sounds. I explained the scene to Vince. That's what I want, I told him. I want separate entrance and exit music. No one's ever done that before. The entrance will be scary, but the exit will be beautiful. I want to be completely at peace with myself after destroying my opponent. I see, said Vince. Let me think about that as well. I then continued laying out some ideas for the character that I had gotten through reading the crime novels of Jonathan Kellerman. Kellerman was a psychologist turned author, and I was always enthralled by how the plot was usually driven by some obscure mental illness or condition. I proposed some really far out ways to work these into storylines, none of which ever made it to fruition, but probably were good for some raised eyebrows around Titan Towers. Vince then prepared me for some big news. I could see he was excited about what he was going to say. Did anyone tell you your name yet? He asked me with a smile. No, I said. What is it? Well, Vince continued in his very descriptive way, in this business we've had crushers, we've had bruisers, we've had destroyers, but we've never had a mutilator. And that's what you most certainly are. A mutilator. Oh God, I thought. Just when things were going so well, I could hear the dreadful name rolling slowly and painfully across Vince's lips. Mutilator. I wanted to go home. Or to Japan where it would still Cactusa Jack, the king of the death match. What do you think? Vince boomed. I struggled for something to say and came out with the three most untruthful words I've ever spoken. I like it. Vince wasn't through yet, though. We'll need a first name, too, he said. I know you used to use the name Manson. I did, I replied, but it was never really comfortable with it. I didn't like the association with a killer. Vince smiled. I was hoping you'd feel that way because we'd like to call you Mason. Mason the Mutilator. I again pledged my undying support for the name, but inside my head I was searching desperately for a way out. I had always felt that it was not good enough to shoot something down. It was best to have a solution. I nodded and smiled blankly while mentally trying to dig my career out of the huge hole that Vince had just thrown it in. Suddenly, a light flashed in my head. Vince, I just had an idea. As much as I like Mason, I lied, knowing that my nose wouldn't start growing right in the middle of him. I think I have an even better idea. Really? Vince said with sincerity. Well, I'd like to hear it. Well, I asked, what if you were to call me Mankind the Mutilator? Vince seemed puzzled. I'm not sure I understand, that's all he said. I had his interest, but it was important to try to nail it now. If I couldn't sell him on Mankind now, I knew I never would. You see, Vince, the name would have a double meaning. I could talk about the future of mankind or the destruction of mankind, and it would carry two different meanings. I could also blame mankind as people for creating mankind as a person. Then when I talk about mankind the mutilator, I could either be talking about myself or be making an indictment of the whole human race. Vince seemed genuinely impressed. I like that, he nodded. Let's go with it. I don't think you can overestimate the importance of your name in pro wrestling. A good name won't make you, but a bad name sure as hell can break you. When Steve Austin joined the World Wrestling Federation, he was named the Ringmaster, a gimmick that was mediocre at best. Looking for change in character, Austin suggested a personality that was somewhat cold-blooded. The creative people got a little carried away with the cold temperature as opposed to the cold attitude and sent him 3 pages of names that included Ice Dagger and Chili McFreeze. Looking back, even if every other thing in Steve's career had been the same, the names would have been killed him deader than poor Kelsey's nuts. Same glass breaking, same music, same sunner, same beer, same middle finger, it wouldn't have mattered. As soon as he walked down the aisle and announced as Baron Von Ruthless, you could have stuck a fork in him. It'd have been done. There's one more thing we need to know, Vince declared. I need to know that you're completely comfortable with your gimmick costume. You're going to be wearing it for a long time, and I need to know that you're completely happy with it. I thought about it. I knew I had suggested and asked for a lot of things, that Vince had listened and been more than fair about all of them. I thought maybe I should just stay put with the costume card I had been dealt. Then I thought about my future and how silly I could look in this sort of fake chain metal fabric that made me look like an extra in a Knights of the Round Table film. It was do or die time. Vince, I did have one small concern, I managed to squeak out. Vince seemed genuinely amused by my opinions. Most people met with Vince and didn't speak a word against any idea the World Wrestling Federation had because they were just so happy to be there. Surely PJ Walker knew that his Aldo Montoya gimmick was doomed as soon as he saw the yellow jockstrap they wanted him to wear on his head, but he never spoke a word. Surely a veteran like Ron Simmons had second thoughts when Vince showed him the blue helmet that he was supposed to wear, but he walked out that office looking like a black Spartacus anyway. I was determined not to make the same mistake. Yeah, Vince, what about the gimmick? I continued. Yes, Mick, what is it? Well, I tried to think how I could delicately phrase this. I hate it, Vince. I really hate it. Vince couldn't help but laugh at my exuberance. Tell me what you hate about it, and we'll try to come up with something else. I took the gimmick out of the bag and pleaded my case further. Vince, it's just that I feel like I'm playing dress up in a movie. Vince looked and immediately agreed. This is not what we want, he said, and summoned one of the people from Creative Services. Mick needs a new outfit. He needs something that looks like he made it in his basement. Can we work on that? Debbie Bonanzio was the woman from Creative Services who immediately began modifying the look until it was simply a ragged brown shirt. It certainly looked like it came from my basement, but now I was dressed in brown from head to toe and was afraid that I would look like a giant turd. I asked about breaking up the monotony of the giant turd by putting a large symbol on the back, and when pressed further, suggested a homemade peace sign. That idea was shot down, but Debbie was told to research it, and a week later, a sketch of mankind's new symbol, an amalgamation of a life sign and a Celtic cross, was approved. I was happy with the promise of the character and was enthusiastic about making it work. Even the contract, which guaranteed nothing but an opportunity, seemed agreeable that day. I had requested several small changes to the contract, which the company had obliged, and I was sure that the money would take care of itself. Our lease was up in West Babylon, and our renters had moved out in Georgia, so I packed up our belongings and headed south as a proud member of the World Wrestling Federation.